Once upon a time in Lugunica II, LQAI translation, one stranger. Marcos Kun. On the way back from the training grounds inside the royal castle's grounds, called to from behind in such a gentle voice, Marcos Gildark froze. Even though, as a member of the royal guard, he was in a position where he should never skip the tempering of body and mind so as to cultivate a robust physique and a sturdy spirit at all times. That was a fatal blunder. Had the other party been a hostile presence, it would not have been strange for his head to be lopped off in that very instant. That said, the owner of that voice bore no hostility toward him, and what was more, even had Marcos had not presented a fatal opening, she could easily have taken that thick neck. She was that sort of person, because, Marcos, it has been a while, Lady Therja. A beat late, Marcos turned and responded with a formal salute to the woman standing there. She was a woman distinguished by beautiful red hair like burning flames, with clear blue eyes, white skin, and the slender bearing of a woman in her prime, a beauty in her prime. Yet to Marcos's eyes, what stood out was how extraordinarily aligned her axis was as she stood so casually. She wore an awfully pristine air, and her perfectly refined carriage was that of one who stood at the very summit of the martial arts. But that, too, was only natural, for the one before Marcos now was the sword saint, Therja Vanistria, said to possess the strongest and most excellent swordsmanship in the dragon kingdom of Lugunica. At Marcos's salute, Therja smiled and said, Therja, my, your salute has gotten awfully fitting, hasn't it? And the Royal Guard uniform, yes, it suits you well. You have gained some gravitas. Casting her eyes up and down, Therja looked Marcos over from head to toe and murmured such impressions. While Marcos remained tense, her attitude was easygoing, far removed from severity. At that, Marcos, whose face was said to be like a sheer rock face, lowered the ends of his brows. Marcos, to be praised so by you, Lady Therja, is, I am humbled. Therja, so you have become so formal. It feels like quite a change from Marcos Gildark, the musclehead who would bow to no one. Marcos, spare me the talk of the past. After being beaten down by Commander Wilhelm, I fully realized how conceited I had been. Therja, I see, that is for the best. Working under that man is hard, is it not? He has always been someone whose words are lacking by one word, even two. Though she said so with troubled brows, Therja's lips softened with fondness. In them bled an undiminished, great affection that had not faded with the years for the person brought up in the conversation, her husband, Wilhelm van Astria. Wilhelm, who was also the commander of the Royal Guard to which Marcos belonged, was a soldier known at home and abroad as the man who had defeated the Sword Saint. Even now, with 50 just before him, there was no dimming to his swordsmanship, and even now he continued to reign as one of the kingdom's very strongest, the pinnacle among its warriors. Therja. And yet even from such a lofty station, he is also a scatterbrain who forgets his lunch. Marcos, so you went to the trouble of bringing the commander's lunch yourself, Lady Therja? Lifting the bundle she held, Therja nodded, that is right, to answer Marcos's question. Then she turned her steps toward the guard's guardroom. Therja, as much as possible, I want to handle by myself the things that concern Wilhelm. That is a wife's duty, is it not? Marcos, unfortunately, being single, I have nothing to say to that. Therja, yes, that is right. Marcos Kun is still unmarried. At Marcos's shrugging answer, Therja thought for a moment. Then, timidly, she looked up at Marcos, with whom she had a difference in height. Therja, if you would like, shall I take care of it for you? Marcos, why do you sound so delighted about that? Therja, because marriage is such a wonderful thing. No matter whose it is, if I can be involved in it, would that not be lovely? Marcos, unfortunately being single. Pressed forward by Therja's earnest appeal, Marcos, overwhelmed, nevertheless answered thus. She went in dissatisfaction at that answer, but if he let slip a careless reply, she truly might go and pick out a marriage partner for him. Of course, it was true that as the heir to House Gildark, he bore the duty of one day taking a wife and begetting children. But Marcos, for the time being, I seem to be up to my neck with my own affairs. Therja, if you keep saying things like that, you will stay single forever, you know. It does not have to be because of my meddling, but if you find someone nice, do not hesitate, all right. Marcos, I will keep it in mind. Thereja. Very good. Then I shall go to Wilhelm. Having forcibly pressed the matter upon Marcos, Thereja nodded in satisfaction. Long since ceased to swing a sword, the sword saint set foot toward the guardroom with that in hand. Thereja, see you, Marcos-kun. Come over to eat at our place once in a while. Marcos, it would be far too presumptuous. Waving her hand lightly, Marcos watched the slim back as she walked away. Only when Thereja's figure had completely vanished from sight did the strength finally leave his shoulders. It was not as though Thereja had been putting pressure on Marcos in particular, but stranger. Well now, I had heard that Lady Thereja Van Astrea was an approachable person, but I did not think she would be quite so easygoing. Marcos. Suddenly, another person's voice struck Marcos's ears as he was seeing Thereja off. At that voice, Marcos knit his brows and turned. His eyes met a dusky blonde youth who was walking slowly toward him from the castle courtyard. Realizing that the other was someone he knew, Marcos visibly twisted his cheek. Marcos, what the hell are you doing in a place like this, Russell? Russell, my, what a greeting. Just a moment ago, you paid so much courtesy. Am I to take this as being acknowledged as a friend with whom you may speak casually? Marcos, this is called being curt. I only pay manners and respect to those worth paying them to. Russell, harsh. So saying, and not even trying to hold it in, he shrugged his shoulders. He was Russell Fellow, the second son of the Fellow family, a merchant house operating in the royal capital. Marcos had become acquainted with him a short while earlier through a third party, and though his limp appearance belied it, he possessed steady nerves, and Marcos evaluated him as a youth with uncanny grit. That said, no matter how gutsy he was, sneaking into the royal castle was going too far. Marcos, by my position, I have to escort suspicious persons who enter the castle grounds right back out, you know. Russell, if you mean me when you say suspicious person, that is quite the misunderstanding. I would never do something like go up into the castle without permission. Today I have come to take orders on behalf of my father and elder brother, that is all. Marcos, to take orders, huh? Russell, yes. Fortunately, the Fellow family is trusted by the Merchants' Guild in the royal capital. In this way, I am also allowed up to the castle from time to time. With a hand to his chest, answering calmly, Russell drew a dubious look from Marcos. To be frank, Marcos felt uneasy about Russell coming and going freely in the castle. He did not think Russell bore malice or treason toward the kingdom in particular, but the youth possessed an acuity of eye and a cunning out of keeping with his age and station, and there was only a nebulous concern that one could not tell what he might pull. And as if to substantiate Marcos's unease, Russell, even so, Lady Thereja does say cruel things. Marcos, what? Russell, no doubt it is because she sees nothing but Commander Wilhelm Sama, but she is far too oblivious to her own charms. For Lady Thereja to offer to introduce you to a marriage partner must be agony beyond compare for you, Sir Marcos. Marcos, you boz. At his calm yet assured manner of speaking, Marcos could not help widening his eyes. In response to Marcos's reaction, Russell raised a finger to his own lips. Russell, do not worry, I will not tell anyone. The royal guard's promising young man's faint crush, that is information a touch too delicate to handle. Marcos, is that a threat? Russell, when I have told you I will not tell anyone, if you still take it so, I have no move left to play. At Russell, who raised both hands as if to say there was no artifice, Marcos clenched his molars hard. Even if it were told, it would only be Marcos who would be embarrassed, but to make it awkward to face Thereja or Wilhelm would be a pointless blow. Russell, too, no doubt understood that the information had no effect beyond harassment. By the way, he said, switching the topic, Russell, I am glad to have met you here. I was just looking for you, Sir Marcos. Marcos, me, what for? Russell, to put it plainly, it is a well-meaning tip. In truth, over in the slums, some fellows engaging in suspicious movements have been sighted. Marcos, and why me for that? That is the City Watch's job. Russell, because the place they are using happens to be one that the Brotherhood used to come and go from. Lowering his voice a touch, Russell pressed him thus, and Marcos ground his teeth. Earlier, the talk involving Thereja had indeed not been a threat. Rather, if anything was a threat, it was this information. Far more serious was the fact that, Until recently, Marcos had served as the ringleader of the slum gang that had been active in the royal capital, the Brotherhood. Most of the Brotherhood's associates had already left the capital and were working as labor to help develop the industrial city of Kostul. But that was that. This was this. Russell, regardless of what remains there now, it would not be convenient to have outsiders enter. I felt I owed a warning to you and to Roswell as well. Marcos, are you calling that bastard? Russell, I cannot very well summon a busy Margrave so easily. Of course, should this be beyond your ability to handle, I would have no choice but to take such measures, but… Marcos. No, forget it. At the mention of the young Margrave's name, Marcos shook his head at the turn toward calling him. As Russell said, one ought not trouble someone in a position like that over trifles. All the more so because if that young lord got involved, there was a fear the matter would grow far too large. When the thought was to resolve the situation with only themselves, that would be putting the cart before the horse. Marcos. I will head over. Tell me the details. At Marcos, who cut in thus, Russell nodded as if he had expected it. Understood. At the smoothness of that reply, Marcos thought anew. He was a youth whose depths could not be seen, no less than, if not more than, that young Margrave. Too originally, the Brotherhood was not the work of any particular person. It was a group that sprang up spontaneously out of the anger of those who had let dissatisfaction and gloom build up. That Marcos came to sit as the head of such a phenomenon-like group began when, ordered on a mission to suppress them, he learned the cause of their activities and abandoned the mission. Thereafter, for various reasons, the Brotherhood disbanded, and Marcos sought to return to the Royal Guard. Yet eyes on Marcos, who had abandoned his duty for selfish reasons, were severe, and reinstatement was a thorny path. Even so, the Royal Guard is meritocratic. Bat back bad press and prejudice with your own sword work. So ran the gracious directive of the commander of the Royal Guard, who permitted Marcos's return. As expected of the man who, by raw ability, defeated the Sword Saint, took her for his wife, and built the position he now holds, he spoke differently. Besides, Marcos agreed with meritocracy. It was just what he wanted. Hence, since then, Marcos had been the first to volunteer to cut into the field himself. Ultimately, he believed the only place he could bring out his true worth was the very front line. However, stranger. Marcos, everyone's taken their positions. They say we can go any time. Saying so, Marcos looked down at the red-haired colleague and trusting him with the signal to begin the operation. Under that gaze, the man knit his brows and went, "What, stranger? You're the squad leader for this mission. We need your orders, Marcos. Why did you even tag along? You're absolutely useless." Stranger, WH. At that blunt question, the man's eyes flew wide and he made a stricken face. From Marcos's standpoint, however, it was the man's reaction that was surprising. He must have heard that assessment so often he was sick of it, yet he could still be freshly wounded by it. "Stranger, I came all this way and you call me useless. That's going too far." Marcos. "That's exactly the point, what we don't need. The others are one thing, but what good are you here, Heinkel?" Ignoring Heinkel Estria's mouth opening and closing like a fish, Marcos looked over the knights cooperating in the slum roundup and cocked his head. They would fulfill their roles, but Heinkel. Marcos, racking up points is my aim too, but I can at least say I'm a shade better than you, seeing as I'm prepared to put my body on the line. Heinkel. It's a mission. Don't say something so ill-sounding as racking up points. And implying I don't have resolve, that's an insult. Marcos. Don't raise your voice. Forgotten what we came here to do. Face flushed, Heinkel hastily clapped his mouth shut at Marcos's rebuke. That he covered his mouth with both hands, there was lamentable for a man on an active scene who should be aware this was the field. One hand should always be kept ready to reach a weapon. What did it say about the fact that a knight could call himself one with this level of deficiency? It fell to Marcos to cover for that lack, to heap up the mound, as it were. Marcos, I won't tell you to go home now, but don't get in the way. Keep to the edge and stay hidden. Leaving that behind and turning his back, Marcos glared at the ruin for which they had received information, the building serving as the base of the suspicious figures Russell had tipped him off about. Tattered though it was, the surprisingly solid building had originally been a church, where those who offered prayers to the divine dragon gathered. That it had been abandoned and turned into the meeting hall of the Brotherhood, a gathering of youths harboring discontent with the kingdom, was an ironic story. When they disbanded, he had done a general cleanup, and there should have been nothing left lying around that would carelessly tie back to Marco's. But there might be something disadvantageous to those working in Costul. If, in the confusion, he could smash the building as a whole, there would be no loose ends. Even so, Marco's. No one's here. Gazing fixedly at the ruin and focusing his awareness on the presence within, he found nothing caught in his net. There seemed to be rats, but they were cohabitants of the slums. It would be unkind to chase them out lightly. Perhaps the other party was away during the day, or perhaps Russell had sent him on a wild goose chase. Marco's. I'll go take a look inside. Saying so nonchalantly, he ordered Heinkel and the knights to stand by and went into the ruin. For now, rats were all he had to show for it, but if he could find some excuse to rampage a bit, he wanted to crush the building physically. It was just as Marco's was picturing a solution by brute force that, out of the shadowy darkness of the corridor, a surprise blow struck Marco's in the throat. Marco's. Gug caught unguarded by a ferocious hit. Marco's giant body let out a groan and slammed into a wall. Smashing through the corridor wall from his back and toppling into a room, he blinked through the pain and shock. He had not sensed the presence at all. Attacker, the royal guard. Seeing the uniform on the fallen Marco's, the one who had landed the blow spat that out. Without checking whether Marco's was dead or alive, the opponent swiftly spun on his heel and bolted out of the ruin. Wait, with his throat struck, he could not voice it at once, and Marco's forced his body up. His ears caught the clashing of swords as his colleagues began to fight outside the building. At a glance, no, at a listen, Marco's knew the flow was unfavorable and he stamped down hard. Marco's. Ooh. The next instant, at the shock wave from Marco's stomp, the ruin's walls and floors blew away together. Bursting out with the debris in tow, Marco's view took in the surroundings of the building. The sight of knights knocked down, and Heinkel plopped on his rear. Right in front of Heinkel, a gaunt man was raising his long arms, and into that back, Marco's, who had leapt out, drove a vicious elbow. Attacker. Gee, Bujay. The feel of shattering the opponent's spine and the bones around it with a direct hit rebounded up Marco's arm. It was the kind of savage pursuit that would either kill, or if not, leave one unable to walk for life. The body bounced like a handball, rocketing into the neighboring ruin, caving it in completely and producing a heap of rubble. Marco's. Heinkel, tend to the ones who are down. Heinkel, Marco's, move it. Heinkel, yes, sir. Sitting on the ground, gaping, Heinkel sprang up at the bark, clicking his tongue at the disgraceful display. Marco's also moved to tend to his comrades. A faint, yet certain growl reached his ears, and Marco's faced the mound of rubble before him. From beneath the debris of the ruin into which he had just slammed the enemy, that growl had come. The next moment, the source of the growl blew the rubble away and emerged. Stranger. Ooh-oon. A gaping maw lifted to the sky, and a beast's bellow rent the slums. Hurling rubble aside, it roared with savage vigor, dark brown, imposing, aberrant, inhuman. It was unlike the form just before it. Its whole body was sprouting animal fur, and with a head transformed, it turned to the sky. A werewolf. The werewolf's twin pupils turned golden, and with eyes clouded by anger and hatred, it glared at Marco's. And werewolf. Sorry, but you lot. It opened a mouth lined with sharp teeth and was about to hurl some kind of threat. Marco's rammed a fist into its throat, forcing it into silence. Werewolf. Gick! As payback for that first strike to his own neck, the werewolf let out a warped groan and bulged its eyes. Marco's then seized the werewolf's head and, without mercy, slammed it down into the ground. With an impact that buried its entire head in the hard earth, the werewolf's whole body convulsed violently. Presently, strength left the werewolf's limbs, and its beastification slowly unraveled. Marco's. And it's still alive, unlucky bastard. It was rolling its eyes white and convulsing, but breathing. It was not the breathing of one about to die, either. As the fur fell off, and underclothing torn from its inability to endure the swelling of its flesh, a scrawny man's bare body came to light. Marco's let go of the head he had been gripping and pitied the fact. Had the body not been so tough for no good reason, he could have killed him with that last blow. The fact he had not been able to meant that the fate awaiting this werewolf, Heinkel, Marcos, a werewolf, a werewolf. Letting his voice crack to shout what was obvious was Heinkel behind him. Having watched Marcos's fight with the werewolf, he was aghast at the form the opponent had reverted to, and his hands tending the injured had also stopped. Marcos sighed deeply. Marcos, I know without you telling me, you keep treating the others. Heinkel, do you really understand, Marcos? There's the treaty with the Valatian Empire. Werewolves, especially criminals, go to the Empire. Marcos, didn't you hear me? With a low voice, he cowed him in a way even the thick-headed Heinkel could understand, and this time Heinkel stuffed his grating objections back down his throat. The situation was depressing enough as it was. At the very least, he wanted those on his own side to show some consideration for what was on Marcos's mind. Marcos, I hardly think I'll be in any shape to go over for a meal. So muttered Marcos, answering with a hoarse voice to the brief exchange he had had before the mission, thinking of the report he now had to make, the cold treatment he had given to the son of Derja, who had invited him to eat, and even that he had failed, in the confusion, to destroy the meeting hall. Marcos's mood grew heavier than even the boulder's expression. 3. The royal capital, Lugunica, is the largest city in the dragon kingdom of Lugunica. Beginning with Lugunica Castle, facilities with all manner of functions exist in and around the city. The stone tower that rises on the capital's western side is likewise one of the capital's distinctive facilities. That stone tower was built roughly 25 years ago, and as a facility, its role lies in the research and development of magic, namely, the Royal Research Institute of Magic. Long regarded as a special power wielded only by certain demi-humans and spiritual arts users, magic is to have its mechanisms laid bare, organized into a general system, and have its user base broadened. Or else, magic that produces wholly unknown effects is to be newly developed and preserved for posterity. That is the objective. At present, there are not many things that can be trumpeted as achievements, but it is a place where success is awaited in the long view. The completion of guides for the systematization and acquisition of simple magic, and development expected by tying in with magic creation tools produced in the industrial city of Kostul, among other things. The development of this field constitutes a sure benefit to the kingdom compared to other nations, and for that reason, the Magic Research Institute is given that much importance. Roswal. One would think that's how it ought to be, but it just isn't going quite as we'd like. Now, so said the boy with heterochromatic eyes, Roswal L. Mathers, as he carefully set a piece of magic ore atop the apparatus, appraising the Institute's sorry bustle. What Roswal was currently engaged in was a reproduction experiment for magic that, using magic ore, crystallized mana, made auxiliary use of mana outside the body rather than one's own internal mana. By succeeding in this experiment, it would become possible to activate magic without going through the gate, the organ necessary to handle magic, or even in a state where one's mana had been depleted. Russell. That said, once the system for mass-producing magic creation tools is in place, the value of using things like magic stones will be diverted heavily in that direction. I cannot see much of a future where this is widely utilized, can you? To Russell Fellow, who peered in from the side at the apparatus on which the magic ore had been placed and poured cold water on Roswal's experiment, Roswal prefaced with not necessarily, then continued. Roswal, if we can codify the acquisition of this technique, then having the sons and daughters of nobles carry even a single magic stone as a kind of charm would become a means of self-defense. This Royal Research Institute of Magic imposes no restrictions whatsoever on the provision and acquisition of techniques. But the handling of something with added value would be a different matter, wouldn't it? Russell. I see. If demand for magic stones rises, it will generate great profits for you, who owns the mines where magic ore is unearthed. Your intent is easy to grasp. It was pleasant to converse with a partner who, if you spoke one, would intuit all the way to 10. While satisfied with this exchange with the rare friend named Russell, Roswal was, on the other hand, not satisfied with how the Magic Research Institute was being treated. Roswal, Frankly, for the time being, the kingdom's attention is skewed toward magic creation tools. If there's a point of reflection, it's that the convenience of those tools has sunk too deeply into daily life. Russell. If you call it a point of reflection that you made the common folk, who had thought of magic as something out of a picture book, understand that magic is something close at hand, then the previous Roswell, your father, would find little recompense in that, would he not? Roswell, oh, my father would share my view, I'm sure. I've every confidence in that. At Roswell's answer, given with a shrug, Russell returned the gesture in kind. The predecessor he had mentioned, Roswell K. Mathers, was the very person hailed as the father of magic creation tools, which brought revolutionary progress to the uses of magic stones. Magic creation tools, powered by magic stones including magic ore, spread branches of possibility far exceeding something like lagmite ore, which merely emitted light, and were rapidly permeating the lives of the kingdom's people, commoners included. Their effects and merits were said to rival even the meteor, which in the witch era, before the ravages of the Witch of Envy, had been created to exist. But, Roswell, if you ask me, that's nothing but an overawed evaluation. The meteor was a tool to realize phenomena and miracles unattainable by human hands. At bottom, it competed on a completely different stage from magic creation tools that merely assisted in daily life. Truly, the meteor was something that, as if letting one's hand reach the stars was godlike. Russell. To be so highly praised and yet not be satisfied by it, rather than saying your greed is deep, it seems the very premise of what you seek, something other than honor or preferment, differs. Catching Roswell's murmur, Russell interpreted it thus. A difference in premise, a gap in what one values. Such things readily alienate people from one another, switching over to the cognition that one's neighbor is someone incomprehensible. In ancient times, the reason witches were hated more than their special power was precisely that difference in values. However, to that divide Russell added, all the same, and said, Russell, if there are things I consider valuable that you do not, and things you desire that I do not, that makes it easy to partition our spheres. What is needed is not an understanding of each other's values, but respect for each other's values. Wonderfully low consumption. Russell, what is it, Roswell? With a hand to his narrow chin and a frown, Russell asked. Roswell shook his head. No. Roswell, I was just thinking again. That you're a friend not easily come by, Russell. For someone who hardly opens his heart, that's something, but being praised without reserve like this is rather embarrassing, you know. Roswell. Hardly opens his heart. You mean Marco's. Conjuring up in his mind the stern-faced man, Roswell nodded in understanding. Among those Roswell had become acquainted with in the royal capital, separate from those of the Brotherhood and the Golden Wing faction who were now helping expand Costul, the Mathers main house's city, there were two he kept as friends, Russell and the aforementioned Marcos. Unlike Roswell, who was not usually in the capital, both Russell and Marcos lived in the royal capital. Naturally, they would have dealings in places Roswell did not know. Among those, it seemed, there had been situations that had made Russell want to put a hand to his forehead. Russell, between ourselves here, a matter recently arose for which I wanted to borrow the Royal Guard's strength, and on that occasion I relied on Sir Marcos's arm, but... Roswell. Oh, that's quite all right. If it's him, he can subdue most opponents. I think it was the best choice, so long as your opponent wasn't a dragon. Russell. Fortunately, it was not a dragon, but it was a troublesome foe. A wolf. Roswell. A wolf. At Russell's voice, which had dropped in tone, Roswell raised an eyebrow and stilled his hands. Bringing up a dragon had been a simple jest, but if a wolf came up instead, that complicated matters. Werewolves, once turned, in the Valatian Empire are treated as culprits whose very existence is not permitted. Wolf folk and mole folk are objects of aversion in that country, and the magnitude of their hostility even splashes onto other nations. That is to say, there is a treaty. Upon discovery, werewolves are to be handed over to the Empire. Naturally, a werewolf thus surrendered cannot escape execution in the Valatian Empire. It is a cold-blooded policy. The Valatian Empire laid down for the extinction of a race over a long span. Roswell, If it's werewolf-related, the Valatian Empire will get noisy all of a sudden, Russell. Exactly that. To put it plainly, what I brought Sir Marcos was information about suspicious individuals having been sighted. But because it turned out to be a werewolf, I'm being treated like a jinx. Roswell. I see. From your standpoint, it was a consideration to let Marcos, whose position in the Royal Guard is delicate, earn merits, and yet he thinks you've only increased his troubles. A tragedy. Russell. Yes, a tragedy. Nodding together, Roswell and Russell found common ground by making Marcos the villain. Of course, Roswell did not trust Russell's goodwill without a speck of cloud. By Roswell's surmise, Russell stood suspected as the mastermind who had shepherded those bearing the capital's pent-up frustrations, those other than the firstborn sons of nobles, and organized the patriotic group called the Golden Wing faction. That such a man had approached Marcos, who belonged to the Royal Guard. That made it a safe bet that the suspicious persons were, 9 times out of 10, suspected by him to be something other than mere suspicious persons. Even so, that did not mean Russell's goodwill toward Marcos was altogether non-existent. Roswell. But, judging from where the story is headed, that werewolf was taken alive, yes. In that case, it seems likely the flow is to hand him over to the Empire. Russell, in fact, I hear it is proceeding in that direction. I expect some manner of démarche from the Empire in the near future. Roswell. And that, too, becomes the Royal Guard's business, that of the discoverer Marcos. No wonder he bears you a grudge. Considering relations with the neighboring Valatian Empire, there were many in the Royal Guard who did not want entanglement. Marcos was, unsurprisingly, among that number. For Roswell as well, relations with the Empire souring at this juncture would be outside his plans. He wanted this knotty affair to resolve as peaceably as possible. It was just then that Roswell was thinking that researcher, M. Margrave, director, Margrave Mathers. A flustered, disjointed shout rang out, and Roswell and Russell turned. At the entrance to the research room stood a pale-faced young researcher. He was one of the Institute's staffers, a person of reasonably high initiative, but Roswell. Ilzia Kun, what's the matter? You were assigned to sort the delivered magic ore into high-purity and low-purity lots, weren't you? Russell. Are you making a supposedly valuable member of staff do such menial chores? Roswell. The point is to train the eye. Truly, if they're specialists, they ought to be able to tell the quality of a magic stone at a glance. Even chores have their meaning. Naturally, there was also a side of Roswell that did not want those who lagged him by 10 or even 100 steps in matters of magic to get in the way of his focused research. Ilzia. It's terrible. There is someone who says they want to observe. Ignoring Roswell and Russell's conversation, Ilzia reported in a trembling voice. At its content, Roswell raised an eyebrow with a hum. Whatever the results, this Royal Research Institute of Magic was a kingdom-sponsored facility. It would not be unusual for persons of importance in the kingdom to take an interest, but if it was a tour, he wanted notice in advance. If they came on the spur of the moment, there were preparations to be made on the receiving side as well. Roswell, in short, it's an unreasonable request. Even you should be able to judge that, no? Even if the guest were His Majesty the King, we'd have to ask them to withdraw. Ilzia. Really? You would refuse even if it were His Majesty? Roswell. Well, if the guest were His Majesty, I'd think about how to refuse. Is the guest His Majesty? Ilzia. And no, it is not His Majesty, but. Ilzia's hesitation was excessive. At that irresolute attitude, Roswell and Russell looked at each other, then simultaneously slipped past him. Rather than continue the discussion like this, it would be quicker to meet this visitor directly. That was their judgment. In fact, that thought was correct. However, stranger. Oh, at last someone who looks able to talk has shown their face. So said the person who greeted Roswell and the others, standing with legs braced at the Institute's entrance. She was a hard-eyed woman with richly wavy, dark-hued red hair gathered behind her head, older than Roswell, younger than Russell, perhaps. With long, slender limbs and a supple build, there was a firmness of core to her imposing carriage. At a glance, one could tell she was the sort of woman the weak-willed Ilzia would be bad with. But the biggest reason the trainee researcher had been at a loss was at her collar, which bore a self-assured smile. Upon the woman's fine attire at her neckline was a crest, the sword wolf, a wolf pierced by a sword, signifying the Valatian Empire. Which is to say, this woman's identity was, Serena, I am Serena Drackroy, arrived as a special envoy from the Valatian Empire. I heard that this is the institution where the kingdom researches magic. I request a tour. Thus did the envoy from the neighboring country, with almost absurd aplomb, proclaim herself an uninvited guest. For Serena, I am, by nature, a hasty sort. The handover of the werewolf is scheduled for tomorrow, but I arrived in the royal capital ahead of time. However, it would be troublesome if an imperial wandered the capital at will and caused some incident, would it not? So I caught wind of an interesting rumor. Here, rapping the wall with the back of her hand, knock, knock, the woman who had given her name as Serena Drackroy explained the reason for her visit and her intent. That said, whether that explanation was one they could accept was another matter entirely. Russell, an envoy from the Empire, is it? My, I imagine the state guest house must be in an uproar right about now. Serena, no need to fret so grandly. Your kingdom would not want to create friction with the Empire heedlessly, would it? It is only a matter of you not making a fuss. To Russell's question, Serena answered with a feral, carnivore's smile. Frankly, it was an answer one could only call quintessentially imperial. Roswell, quintessentially imperial speech indeed. Thinking that in all things the strong-armed approach will carry the day, Serena. Oh. Saying aloud precisely the same impression Russell had harbored inwardly, Roswell gave the visitor from the neighboring country a sidelong, piercing look. At that gaze, Serena lightly raised an eyebrow. Then tapping twice beneath each of her eyes with 2 fingers, she said, Serena, your eyes are different colors, left and right. Rare, but beautiful. Looking closely, your looks are well above the mark, too. You, how about coming to the Empire and marrying into my house? Roswell. Russell. Is that not rather an inappropriate jest to make to someone at a first meeting, and to a woman besides? Serena. Do not set it upon the scales of man and woman. It is tiresome. I, too, think there are many situations where, had I been a man, matters would proceed more swiftly. With a body trained to supple strength, yet with slender shoulders, Serena snorted as she shrugged. At her reaction, Russell stroked his own chin with a finger, then said, Russell, with respect, Lady Drackroy, are you not aware that this gentleman is Margrave Mathers? Serena, Margrave Mathers, Lugunica's Western Margrave. Russell, just so. Though he bears a heavy burden for the kingdom of Lugunica, the Margrave also applies his brilliance to the development of magic. Truly a person indispensable to the kingdom. Roswell, being flattered that much by a friend tickles a bit. You know, even though he surely understood the intent of Russell's thrown lifeline, Roswell gave that sort of reply. Russell silenced him with a sharp glare. In any case, if Serena realized her counterpart was Roswell L. Mathers, she would surely change her attitude. Surely, as a special envoy, she would not seriously cause an international incident, Serena. I see, then you hold a position. In that case, if I bear a child quickly and make them heir, could I bring you back to the Empire? Roswell, you don't give up. Serena, naturally. I have not lived so obediently as to back down easily. The House of Drackroy, or rather, I am ever hungry, for capable people, for new ideas, and for technology. Spreading both arms to indicate the stone tower that was the Institute itself, Serena declared thus. At that audaciously invasive pronouncement, Ilzia and the other researchers looked to Roswell with troubled faces. As both noble and director, only he could stand against the Empire's envoy. But Roswell, at Serena's declaration, closed the yellow one of his eyes and said, Roswell, I understand that you judged me capable, but are you interested in magic? Serena, I am. The magic creation tools that have lately begun to be put to use in the kingdom draw my interest as well. But what stirs my curiosity more than tools is technique. Russell, that is, Serena. To put it plainly, I have a great interest in magic. I would sooner learn it and take it home with me. Grinning, Serena thumped her own ample chest with a fist. At that imperial sort of avaricious stance, Roswell opened the eye he had closed, and with both eyes looked at her straight on. At the light that flitted through those eyes, Russell felt a bad premonition. Driven by it before he could open his mouth, Roswal. "You want to know about magic? Splendid. Very promising. Let us talk, shall we, Serena?" Roswal's outstretched hands seized Serena's, and he spoke first. Serena's reaction lagged a beat at his childlike, sparkling eyes and his momentum and words, but soon realizing that this was a positive attitude, Serena. "Oh, so you will say that. I am grateful. I shall study. Roswal, I will show you to my lab in the back. Come this way, Lady Drakra." Serena, Lady Drakra, is a roundabout way of putting it. Serena will do. Roswal, then Roswal will do for me as well. Roswal. As the two briskly, smoothly advanced the conversation, the one who called Roswal by name in a loud voice was not Serena but Russell. When the two turned at the volume of his voice, Russell beckoned only Roswal over with a finger. "Russell, what do you think you are doing?" Roswal, "And by that you mean?" Russell, "This is an important facility of the kingdom, and she is an honored imperial guest." Lowering his voice, yet making the admonishment plain in it, Russell pressed Roswal. Though their acquaintance was not long, Russell had watched Roswal's movements with attention. He had thought he understood that Roswal bore an extraordinary obsession with magic. But if he was like this simply upon being told someone was interested in magic, he was much too indiscriminate. If that excessive self would constitute a demerit here, then regrettably, the relationship going forward would need to be reconsidered. Regrettably, and Russell was somewhat surprised to think so. Roswal, "Russell, that's a misunderstanding born of differing views." As Russell kept down the hesitation that had arisen in his heart, Roswal's reply cut in. When Russell furrowed his brow, "A misunderstanding." Roswal dipped his narrow chin and nodded. "Roswal, yes. As a matter of principle, the structure of the gate differs between people of the kingdom and people of the empire. The influence of having undergone proper evolution over long years in each land is large. In an environment where heat is harsh, living things acquire traits suitable to living there. Do you see, Russell? You mean the same is true of the gate, the organ that handles magic. Therefore, even if she learns the kingdom's way of using magic, as an imperial she will be unable to handle it." Roswal, "Exactly so. As a teacher giving an impassioned lecture, encountering a student who caught on quickly, Roswal looked satisfied. Russell's bile went down. Yet he was not wholly convinced. Even if, as Roswal said, Serena could not learn the kingdom's method of using magic, she might take the taught mechanisms, adapt them to the imperial way, and rebuild them into something usable in the field. Roswal, "Lady Drakra, Serena, apologies, I have had a keen ear since long ago. Thanks to that, I never miss a whispered secret, which is a help. Oftentimes foolish rumors reach my ears, such as that a father finds his daughter tiresome." Touching her earlobe with a finger, Serena shook the crimson earring without remorse. Setting aside the rights and wrongs of eavesdropping, her point pinned Russell's concern exactly. Even if, as Roswal said, the kingdom's way of using the gate did not apply to imperials as is, that did not mean it would be entirely unusable. Even if it were only the basics, it was undesirable for knowledge of the kingdom to be extracted to the empire. Roswal, "Well now, if that's how it goes, that's quite all right too, isn't it?" To Russell's concern, Roswal responded as if it were nothing at all. Russell stared fixedly at Roswal's face, trying to see through to his intent. But Roswal, without a trace of malice under Russell's gaze, smiled. Roswal, "A field without competitors is apt to advance slowly. The Magic Research Institute, poor in results beyond what the great predecessor began, and the clinics where secret keeping of techniques has gone on for years. One reason great development cannot be hoped for, I think, lies in a lack of a sense of crisis. Russell, and for that you would countenance harming the kingdom's interests. Roswal, I am saying that to partake of a greater gain, a temporary loss should be tolerated." So he continued. A quiet stare-down ensued between Roswal and Russell. Though there were parts of Roswal's argument to which one could nod, in the main it was hard for Russell to accept. That temporary loss, those wounds and the flowing blood, ought not be blithely built into a future plan by those unable to tally them. Was Roswell L. Mathers, after all, a dangerous person for the kingdom of Lugunica? Serena. Let the wolf bite your arm, then you will be able to pierce its trunk with your sword. Roswell. Serena. Words left by the first emperor of Wallachia. The way of being indicated by the sword wolf, our national flag's wolf pierced by a sword, is a reading opposed to this, but I like it. Standing by, in a position hard to call that of a third party, Serena spoke. Sword wolf was an expression used by people of the Wallachian Empire for themselves. It was said to indicate the way of being that, even if one's body were pierced through by a sword as depicted on the imperial flag, one would still tear out the enemy's throat. That sort of will to fight. But Serena's interpretation was the very opposite. Serena. Of course, that serving the empire's good would in turn lead to the kingdom's prosperity is unconvincing coming from me, an imperial. So there is only one thing I can say. Russell, and that is, Serena, I return what I receive, favor or grudge alike. You will not take a loss. Arms folded, Serena declared it forthrightly. Russell narrowed his eyes and pressed his lips together. Ultimately, the Wallachian Empire's policy was to do anything and honor it as right if it was for victory. Aside from the proud look on her face that hinted at that, there was nothing at all by which to believe her verbal promise. However, Roswell, what do you say, Russell? She has gone this far to say it. Serena is a great personage. You have guessed as much already, have you not, Russell? That was not the crux of the issue. Even so, Roswell peered into Russell's face as he posed the question. Sensing a will that would not bend, Russell let out a small sigh then. Russell, in the first place, you are the director of this institute. I am merely an outsider indulging in your kindness by being here. From the start, you have no need of my assent. Roswell. If we speak of the facts, that is not wrong, Buat. Breaking off once, Roswell took a moment to think. For Roswell, who always judged at once and arrived at answers, it was a rare moment of consideration. Russell frowned at it. Lowering his eyes slightly, Roswell said, Roswell, I would prefer not to proceed while greatly souring a friend's mood if I can help it, Russell. Serena. Russell. An unexpected remark, words like those of a person who valued friendships. Russell suspected some kind of jest, yet when he gazed at Roswell's face in earnest, he found no trace of teasing in the expression. As a result, he was taken aback. Russell, I had thought you would not be handled with a single rope, but whether he ought to consider Roswell an uncontrollable hazard or a patriot with great power likely to be guided. Once more, it was content that left him at a loss. And to be honest, this applied not only to Roswell but to Serena as well. Serena. Ha ha ha, how very cute a thing to say. I like you all the more, Roswell. Roswell. Cute is disagreeable. I think you are a few years older in some respects. But what I harbor in this body years you imagine not. I should like to be treated as a gentleman. Serena, you make a trifling difference in age a reason to sulk. That is not merely cute, but adorable. Smiling broadly at the prior exchange, Serena traded words with Roswell. Just as Roswell had said, Russell could clearly see she would become a personage of the first rank or better. He might be said to have an eye for people, but Russell's certainty was of a different sort than such baseless remarks, an unshakable discernment granted by the divine protection of evaluation. The divine protection of evaluation was thought to be a modest blessing that distinguished the good from the bad in things. But Russell's could discriminate even the capable from the incompetent in people, or the superiority among earth dragons. Therefore, he could see that Roswell and Serena were prodigies, and that the timid researchers unable to stand up to Serena were, in fact, talents fit for a royal research institution. Yet the right or wrong of an ability, and how that ability should be used, had to be judged by looking at the person. That was Russell's task, and an urgent matter for the kingdom of Lugunica. Therefore, Russell, if, say, war were to break out between the kingdom and the empire, and magic were to fly at us from the empire, I will stab you from behind. Roswell, now that would be a rare kind of friendship. Would it not? Even in such a desperate situation, you would still be standing behind me. With sarcasm answered by sarcasm, Russell reached an accord with Roswell by choosing to watch how things developed. As he had said from the start, Roswell had no need to seek Russell's permission. On the other hand, Russell did not need Roswell's permission to take his own countermeasures. For each to play his best move, there was no need to lay his heart wholly bare. Serena. It seems the discussion has wrapped up neatly. Now my curiosity has about reached its limit. Let me hear it at once. The delayed Serena clapped her hands and egged Roswell on. At those words, Roswell, unable to hide his joy at a partner interested in magic, nodded. Roswell, I would like to start with the essential question of what the gate is. Buat, Serena. The gem in those earrings of yours is magic crystal, is it not, Serena? It is. When there were signs of rebellion in my family's domain, His Imperial Majesty bestowed it upon me as a reward for its suppression. I am quite fond of it. Chatting animatedly, Roswell and Serena headed toward the back of the Institute. Following the two backs, Russell called softly, Ilzia. At that call, the pale-faced researcher blinked, but Russell, do not neglect caution. If the Margrave takes any suspicious action, inform me of each and every one. Ilzia. Understood. Russell did not cast even a glance at Ilzia, who answered in a voice gone cold, as if he were another person. He only gazed at Roswell's back, cheerfully giving a lecture on magic, and wondering whether he ought to set that boy upon the scale as a friend or as a hazard, could do nothing but let out a heavy sigh. 5. In accordance with the treaty concluded with the Empire, the handover of the werewolf in question, a lagger, to the Empire. That was the content of the next squad assignment given to Heinkel Istria, who had earned merit by capturing the werewolf who had hidden himself in the royal capital. They would receive the special envoy from the Valatian Empire and hand a lagger over. On top of that, they would escort the envoy to the imperial border and complete the transfer without incident. It was an important duty, so as not to worsen relations with the Empire, long gone cold. Serena, you wear quite a brazen face. Seeing the werewolf fitted with manacles and a gag, the Empire's special envoy, who called herself Serena Drakroy, wore a sadistic smile. Though still young, she looked in her teens. Her words and bearing were those of a noble of dignity and lineage, and even her fierce vigor bore an imperial sort of danger. At the very least, it seemed certain she was the kind of talent judged such that neither age nor sex would hinder her appointment. Even so, Heinkel was made to fret by her incautious, overbearing way with those around her. Did she have any awareness that she bore a heavy responsibility for the peaceful relations of both nations? Serena, name, a lagger, a fugitive who fled the Empire and escaped to the kingdom. Though once you took the chains off and let him have his way, he then committed the blunder of getting caught even here in the kingdom, an unlucky man. You who escorted him here, are you the squad that captured this one? Heinkel. Why, yes, that's right. We are the ones who apprehended that werewolf. Addressed out of the blue, Heinkel bitterly regretted that he stumbled over the opening of his reply. Paying no mind to that cause for Heinkel's self-reproach, Serena arched a brow with a hoe. Serena, it may be ungracious to say so, but to think you overpowered him with so few. In our country, he's the sort of fellow who got away after tearing down even a fort. Heinkel, the fruit of our daily training, I would say. Serena, I won't say training bears no fruit, only. So saying, Serena's gaze slipped off Heinkel and was turned toward the squad members lined up behind him. There were 4 in the line. On one of them, Serena fixed her eyes. On Marco's Gildark, so tall one had to look up at him, clad in a cuirass of thick muscle. Serena, one alone is in a different class, yet he isn't leading the unit. A problem child is he. Marcos, if you wish to talk, speak with the squad leader, envoy. I and the others will keep watch on the surroundings. Serena, how cold. Well, fine. There'll be a chance to loosen that tied mouth along the way. At Serena's narrowed eyes, Marcos gave nothing but a by-the-book answer. Even so, Serena's interest in Marcos did not fade, and that in itself was an affront to Heinkel. Skipping over his head as squad leader, Marcos drew the attention, though thinking of Marcos's strength and talent, he knew it was only natural attention. Heinkel, envoy, I would like to discuss the travel plan. Serena, I'll leave it to you. That said, I don't intend to meddle. Kingdom matters should be left to kingdom people. I, too, want to concentrate on what's in my hands for a while yet. Heinkel, what's in your hands? Serena, I'm in the middle of trying something. I learned yesterday from a friend of the kingdom. To Heinkel, who had raised his voice, Serena answered while toying with something in her hands. In her hand she held a soft, silver, thread-like thing that changed shape. Heinkel frowned at the unfamiliar object. Serena said, "This is..." Serena. "If you can pass mana well between your two hands through your internal gate, you can make this silver thread change shape as you please. It's a toy for learning how to channel mana." Marcos. "How to channel mana could it be?" Serena. Has a chance come around at once to loosen that tied mouth?" Serena's explanation meant nothing to Heinkel, but it seemed Marcos had something come to mind in its stead. Even so, he ignored Serena's desire to hear it, hiding his answer behind a boulder-like expression. At Marcos's breach of courtesy, Serena said no matter, and did not censure him. Heinkel, feeling as though he alone had needlessly worn his spirit thin, felt a sense of grievance, but he shook his head. There was no point in making Serena censure Marcos here. And Heinkel, "We commence transport as planned. You are to follow our instructions to the letter." And so, with a gloomy mood hanging about him, the mission began for Heinkel. Those involved were Heinkel as squad leader, Marcos as his lieutenant, 3 Kingdom Knights as squad members, and 4 drivers for the dragon carriages bearing a lagger. In addition were Serena, serving as the Empire's special envoy, and 4 Imperial soldiers as her guards, for a total of 14, a small party. Yet the number of people involved, and the weight of the responsibility incurred often, did not correlate. This case was that sort, and that was exactly why Heinkel's feelings were complicated. Originally, the one who had taken the lead in the roundup of the restrained werewolf had been Marcos. Heinkel and the other knights could not hold their own against the werewolf, a lagger's rampage. Without Marcos, they would have been wiped out and let him escape. Even their lives had been in danger. Nevertheless, Marcos had taken advantage of the fact that the other knights had been unconscious at the time of a lagger's capture and tossed the credit to Heinkel. When asked why, he said something incomprehensible like, "I'm still in the middle of getting my feel back." If he disliked that, one would say Heinkel should have refused as well. Heinkel. Damn! Credit though it had been handed over, Heinkel had wanted it so badly he could taste it. If he was going to fall into self-loathing whether he took it or not, then taking it and hating himself for it was far better. So he thought, and accepted the credit, but in the end the bitterness refused to fade. To cap it off, for the envoy's transport he would be leaving the capital for several days and had to part from his son, Reinhard. Heinkel. Reinhard. Frankly, his son, Reinhard, was in a precarious way. He might be laughed at for a father's bias, but in Reinhard, he felt a natural endowment absent in other children. That included the signs, glimpsed not long ago, of an exceedingly dangerous divine protection. Acting upon the human heart, that divine protection would, if used wrongly, easily make his son the enemy of the world. He had pressed him hard, taught him, and Reinhard had sworn never again to use that divine protection. But Heinkel was not so optimistic as to think a child's self-control could keep a vow absolutely. So he did not want to be away from Reinhard for long, least of all leave the house not to the Fausen couple who ran it, but to his own father and mother. Serena, "Captain, you look awfully strained." Heinkel suddenly peered at from the seat opposite. Heinkel caught his breath. Grinning at his reaction was Serena, who had been playing with the silver thread all along. They had divided the party between 2 dragon carriages and riders on earth dragons. One carriage held a lagger and a watchman from the squad. The other held Heinkel and Marcos, tasked with protecting Serena. They were not a group for lively conversation, nor did they feel any need to make it lively. Serena. Any reason to be uneasy? This isn't the Empire, but the kingdom, is it not? I have no desire to disparage my own country, but if trouble were to arise en route, it's far more likely to be in ours. Heinkel. And no, that is Marcos. In his case, his son clings to his father. That's what's making him uneasy. When Heinkel panicked, fearing he had offended an important personage, the Marcos at his side covered for him. It was barely more than stating the truth, but Serena expressed admiration with a ho. Serena. I see love for one's child. I can hardly fault that. Heinkel. From the look of you, envoy, you seem rather young. Serena. When I see something that glitters, I've a habit of picking it up. That's why there are many children I keep by my side. They all take work, but they're dear, promising little ones. Incidentally, I sense a glitter in you as well. Marcos, spare me the jokes, especially the ones that aren't funny. Serena, my, this country has so many who are cold. In the homeland, I'm in great demand, you know. Waving her hand lightly, Serena traded banter. Yet when she spoke of children, Heinkel sensed a sure kindness that she had not shown until now. At that, Heinkel at last recognized that Serena had faces and a personality beyond imperial envoy. Unclenched the fist he had kept tightly closed and looked down. Then the truth is, he was about to, however reluctantly, take the lifeline Marcos had thrown him. At that instant, guard. Enemy attack! A sharp voice was hurled from outside the dragon carriage, and Heinkel's whole body went rigid. But beside him, Marcos and Serena moved swiftly. Serena at once withdrew to the center of the carriage. Marcos stood and sprang for the door. And even as he flew out, kicking the door open, Marcos, Heinkel. He barely grasped that this was an urging for Heinkel to protect Serena. He grasped it, and that was all. Heinkel could not recover the composure to carry it out. Heinkel, you. A violent jolt came the next moment. The dragon carriage lurched over with tremendous force. Unable to oppose the tilt, Heinkel smashed against wall and seat, screaming. An attack that ought never to have been had fastened its sights upon the party of Kingdom Knights transporting a werewolf and the Empire's special envoy, and was seeking to narrow its encirclement in one fell swoop. 6 guard, enemy attack! Rising at the sharp, warning cry of his colleague, Marcos leapt for the dragon carriage's door. An attack in the midst of escorting the Empire's special envoy, Serena Drakroy, to the imperial border. Given relations between the kingdom and the Empire, anything happening to her would be diplomatically bad. Marcos. Heinkel, calling to Heinkel, who shared the carriage, Marcos urged him to protect the envoy. If the panicked Heinkel could get moving with that, so much the better. And if not, whether he was there or not honestly would not affect the big picture. What would affect the big picture was Marcos. Damn it! The death of the driver handling the carriage, his head burst apart, as seen by Marcos as he clicked his tongue. He had taken some kind of impact to the temple, and everything above the poor driver's neck had been blown off. But Marcos and the others had no time to mourn that death. The next instant, the same impact that had killed the driver flamboyantly obliterated a wheel of the carriage. Heinkel, you. The carriage, having lost its support, tilted violently, and a flipped-over scream rose from inside. It was hard to stomach that Serena, who ought to be protected, stifled her voice, while Heinkel, who ought to protect, was the one screaming. Even so, in the present situation, Marcos could not talk big about Heinkel's disgrace. He, too, was on the back foot and taking hits. Marcos, what about the other carriage? Of the 2 dragon carriages, one carried Serena the envoy, and the other bore the prisoner to be sent to the Empire, the werewolf, a lagger. Unfortunately, the carriages were on a mountain road of narrow width. Since the one in front, this carriage, was no longer able to move, the one behind could not proceed either. If the rear carriage were operable, there would have been the option of transferring Serena aboard and getting her away from here. But Serena. Looks like the wheel on the other one got taken out as well. The carriages are at a standstill. Marcos, you! Serena peeked past Marcos out the side and confirmed the same thing. At her fearless action that made Marcos widen his eyes, she wore a combative smile and, Serena, staying inside like this will only bleed us dry. What now, Marcos? We get outside and use the carriage as a shield. I'll go kill the enemy. Serena, very well. I'm in. Feeling a certain satisfaction at Serena's immediate nod, Marcos glared past her at Heinkel, who was on his knees on the carriage floor. At that gaze, Heinkel called out pitiably, Marcos, but cursing him could wait. Marcos, protect the envoy. She's far more important than your life. Leaving only that, Marcos sprang out of the carriage, deliberately exposing himself to the assassins. It was an obvious bait, but the enemy could not ignore it. The next moment, the same kind of strike that had killed the driver came flying, aimed at the center of Marcos's body. At the flash coming in from the far edge of his vision, Marcos matched it with the sword he had drawn on instinct and batted it aside. Marcos's sword was an extra-large blade that prized unbreakable sturdiness over cutting power. Truth be told, he was better at punching foes directly than handling a sword, but as a knight he could not dispense with one. Besides, in situations like this, having a sword was useful. Marcos. Even I can't realistically swat that away barehanded. From the shock rebounding off the greatsword and the sound of steel against steel, Marcos inferred that the projectile was a sharp, arrow-like bolt. However, two problems arose. The bolt he should have knocked down was nowhere to be seen nearby, and the assassin who had loosed it was nowhere in his sight. A bolt that vanished after it struck, and a troublesome archer who kept his presence wholly concealed. It was when he stayed on guard against that assassin and resolved to play the decoy further stranger. So you blocked that. An enemy cannot be taken lightly. A muffled voice, as if with a sack over its head, landed before Marcos. The one who dropped off the cliff onto the mountain road with a thunderous crash was a giant more than a size taller than the tall Marcos. His entire body was sheathed in dully gleaming, pewter-colored mineral. No, not sheathed. His body itself was made of that pewter-hued mineral. At that appearance and intimidating pressure, Marcos bared his teeth with the hair on his back standing up. Marcos, no way steelfolk. Steelfolk, correct that answer. The dutiful reply came with a likewise dutifully swung, mighty arm. The blow, thick and massive like a column of a great manor, was hurled mercilessly. Marcos met it head-on with his greatsword and held his ground. It was no exaggeration. The destructive force was like a head-on collision with a dragon carriage. As Marcos gritted his teeth and held it back, the steelfolk pressed his arm in and steelfolk. You stopped me. Frightening. Marcos. That's so. You're scared. Then I'll give you something to be even more scared of. With the steelfolk pushing in and applying pressure, Marcos roared and launched a counterattack. Setting all his muscles to a rhythm and shoving the foe back in a snap, Marcos, still supporting the greatsword with one arm, wrapped his free left arm around the opponent's leg and slammed him hard into the cliff. Marcos. Ooh. He drove him into the cliff with enough force for the body to sink in, and the counterattack did not end there. Using the impaled body as his tool, he immediately set about a more large-scale rock-cutting operation. Among demi-humans, the steelfolk were a rare race, distinguished by bodies composed, from birth, of substances such as mineral and metal. As a racial trait, they were, naturally, hard and sturdy, akin to a lump of iron with arms and legs coming at you with fists. With that vaunted body, he would reshape this narrow mountain road. Marcos, as he furiously quarried the cliff with the enemy's body, a sharp sensation drove into his flank, and Marcos clicked his tongue. It was a sniper's shot from an assassin, fired to exploit the opening as he grappled with the steelfolk. The instant it broke the skin of his flank, Marcos clenched the muscle at the point of impact and stopped the bolt. Even so, the fact remained that he was wounded. And on top of that, his attention had been diverted, steelfolk. You stopped that too. You are something. With those words of praise, a hand seized his head, and Marcos and the steelfolk's positions were reversed. The steelfolk grabbed Marcos by the head and swung him around, smashed him back first into the cliff, and drove an arm in as a follow-up. The impact pierced from Marcos's chest through his back, punched into the cliff behind, and cracks ran far and wide. The ensuing rockslide choked the mountain road, and the roiling smoke made the battlefield even worse. And worse yet stranger. Bang, bang, bang! That incongruously lively voice coincided with tremendous sounds of shattering. Beyond the smoke, he saw shattered trees and blood spray rising, and Marcos instinctively knew that this spelled the fate of the second, trailing carriage. The Earth Dragon and its driver, and the guarding kingdom knights and imperial soldiers. Some of them, or perhaps all of them, had been killed. And the one who had done so was now entering this field of battle. Stranger, what, you're still at it, Jimrack. Is something off somewhere, or else is the opponent bad? Indeed, the one who arrived with that shrill racket was a short, gaunt man with sharp eyes. The man sported a long silver tail, and the manner of his entry was stranger than his appearance. For whatever reason, he came in spinning end over end, cleaving the smoke with that tail as he plunged in. The steelfolk, called Jimrack, received the bizarrely arriving man with composure and gimrack. My bad, an opponent, shot down and stopped even the arrows, Elkanes. Stranger, ho ho ho, that's amazing. Just when I thought you'd gone soft under the dragon's covenant, there's someone who can do it halfway decently even in the kingdom. Gimrack, you shouldn't let your guard down. Uluzo, that's your bad habit. Calling the shorty who applauded and praised from on high Uluzo, Gimrack lined up with his comrade, slowly keeping wary watch on his side. Facing the two, Marcos pulled his body free of the cliff and let out a sigh. Both foes were certainly strong. He was clearly on the losing side, but there was nothing to be gained. Marcos, thanks for the flattery about there being someone even in the kingdom. Judging by the mix of races, 9 times out of 10 you lot are Imperials. Your target is the front carriage or the one behind, which? Uluzo. Ha ha ha, I see. Even after getting pummeled this much and that much, you don't go down for free. Good, Kingdom Warrior. A pity it's a surprise operation. He did not answer the question, but neither did he deny the assertion thrown at him. At that point, their affiliation as the Valatian Empire was as good as exposed, but that left no room for the situation to improve dramatically. For improvement, the enemy's heads were required. Marcos, Gimrack, Uluzo, Elkane. Those were the names gleaned from their exchange, and likely the main force of this ambush. Unless he took those 3 heads, there would be no victory and no getting out alive. Uluzo. Coming, are you? The instant he set strength in his knees, Uluzo laughed thus. Thinking how troublesome capable enemies were, Marcos sprang forward as if released. Marcos. Nuan. With a horizontal sweep of the greatsword, he aimed at Gimrack and Uluzo together. Gimrack cut into the sword flash and, with the steel folk's torso, stopped it with his whole body. Steel grated against steel. Sparks flew to the high-pitched sound, and their brute strengths were in balance. And then Uluzo, a quite rather fine sword, but not as fine as mine. Spinning out such strange words, Uluzo intervened in the shoving match brought it to a conclusion. Lightly sprinting up the cliff, Uluzo leapt into midair and spun end over end. With that long tail whistling, he turned into a silver disc and came hurtling in. That bizarre strike of Uluzo's split in 2 the greatsword Marcos had set against Gimrack, and its sheer sharpness made his arms slip free without resistance. In the corner of his shifted vision, a flash whipped by in the distance Marcos. Shit! He twisted his head on reflex and got away with letting the bolt, which should have pierced his skull, gouge only his temple. But the blood streaming down robbed his left eye's vision, and the simultaneous attack of these top-class assassins was a crisis point. A hard, heavy impact and a sharp, deep cut carved a cross-shaped wound into Marcos's chest and blew him away. He rolled far back, rolled on even after tearing through the smoke, and was plastered to the ground. And at the blown-away Marcos, a follow-up came, now of all times Serena. Down! It was a woman's voice, neither Marcos's nor any of the attackers. At that voice, the instant a red light, different from the bolts, leapt at the edge of his vision, Marcos let the strength go from his knees and dropped flat on the spot. The next moment, light flared. A tremendous blast of flame spread as if to swallow the mountain road. 7 Ilzia. Director! Peering at Roswal, who had suddenly broken off mid-conversation, the researcher Ilzia knit his brows. Without responding to Ilzia's call, Roswal strode in silence to the laboratory window, threw it open, and narrowed his heterochromatic eyes at the scene outside. Ilzia. Did I do something? In his timid voice showed the sorrow of a subordinate dealing with a superior who was hard to communicate with. From his perspective, he must have suspected he had, once again, soured the mood of a capricious boss. But Roswal had no room just now to spare a thought for Ilzia's sentiments. Roswal. That disturbance in Mana just now. What faintly pricked Roswal's skin, transmitted through the air, was the sense of a large fluctuation in Mana. Clearly different from something naturally occurring. It was sure proof that someone had intentionally transformed Mana. In other words, proof that magic had been activated. What was more, he had a very recent recollection of that Mana's wavelength, Roswal. Ilzia-kun, get in touch with Russell. Still keeping his eyes outside the window, Roswal told Ilzia behind him thus. At that, Ilzia drew a sharp breath. His eyes wandered. Ilzia, Lord Russell. Just because he's your friend, Director, letting him come and go from the lab too freely is a bit. Roswell. That sort of face-saving talk is fine for Nuo. Right now I want to speak with him. Post haste. Ilzia. No, why are you asking me to? Roswell, if we're to get in touch with Russell, you'd be the quickest, wouldn't you? Saying so, Roswell turned and looked Ilzia squarely in the face. At that gaze, Ilzia's cheeks tightened faintly, his eyes narrowing a touch. That change in atmosphere, that expression, was just the kind of sharpness that made it feel worth inviting him into the lab. It was to Roswell's taste. Roswell, do you recall the magic crystal earrings Serena had? It seems those were used as a catalyst for magic. I suspect there's trouble. Having come at once upon being contacted, Russell received from Roswell this concise explanation. The disturbance in mana and its wavelength that Roswell had sensed, the activation of magic, and the likely catalyst used for it all matched the magic crystal earrings worn by Serena Drakroy, who had visited the tower yesterday. She had said it was an ornament made of very valuable magic crystal, bestowed on her as a reward by the Emperor. But Roswell, it looks like she used it without hesitation when she should. In that respect, her decisiveness is astonishing, but one should say it was an appropriate judgment. Russell, you did speak of a plan to have the sons and daughters of nobles carry magic stones for self-defense. Roswell, it's not a bad feeling to see a technique I taught put to use immediately. Not only does she have the judgment of a noble, but as a pupil, too, she's excellent, most agreeable. Russell, Roswell. With the blue eye closed and Roswell expressing his admiration thus, Russell called to him quietly. As for having been summoned through Ilzia, Russell did not go out of his way to say anything, nor did Roswell intend to press that point. The situation was pressing, and even if it had not been, he probably would not have dug into it. His relationship with Russell was a good friendship, and that impression held even if each had a dagger hidden behind his back. On that basis of a relationship shot through with tension, Russell, fingers to his narrow chin, said, Russell, let us set aside Lady Drakroy's excellence for now. The problem is that she used magic, or rather, that she fell into a situation where she had to use it. You are certain of this, Roswell? No mistake. With magic crystal of that quality, I'm not going to confuse its mana wavelength, the magic pattern overnight, and the way it was used was just as I'd instructed. Russell, as you'd instructed, Roswell. You used the mana stored in the stone and kaboom. At Roswell's explanation, delivered with both hands spread, Russell silently narrowed his eyes. It might have sounded like a joke, but in truth, skillful instruction over just a few hours was difficult. What Serena had been taught was the most efficient way to use up magic crystal. If that had gotten her out of the pinch into which she had fallen, then good. But Roswell, now then, what do you think happened to her? Russell, Lady Drakroy was a special envoy from the Empire. The purpose of her visit was the handover of the werewolf captured in the capital and his escort to the Empire. Roswell, and thanks to the information you provided, Marcos secured the werewolf. Russell, yes. Therefore, Sir Marcos should also be accompanying the handover of the prisoner and the envoy's escort to the border. Roswell, if Marcos is there, I would think it unlikely that anything too serious would occur. Though still young, there were few hands in the kingdom's royal guard more skilled than Marcos's. Frankly, save for the sword demon, Wilhelm van Astria, the captain of the royal guard, and an opponent Roswell would rather not have to face, there were few others. In any case, one could say personnel of the highest standard had been assigned as escort. Even so, Serena had fallen into a situation where she had to use magic of her own accord. Russell, what I can imagine is a situation where Sir Marcos cannot function. Either he was neutralized by some means, or he himself turned against Lady Drakroy. Roswell, the former, but the latter is also hard to imagine. If the latter were to be the case, since Lady Drakroy has activated magic that could be called a trump card, she would be the one attacked, but given his history and thinking, it is not convincing that Sir Marcos would commit such an outrage. Russell, really? He does have a prior record of having given aid to the Brotherhood, does he not? Roswell, Is it not a waste of time to spend on a debate whose conclusion is foregone? Sir Marcos bears no treasonous intent toward the kingdom. If we proceed on that premise, then, breaking off there, Russell briefly met Roswal's eyes. Roswal drew in his chin in turn, and they spoke at the same time. Roswal and Russell, a third-party attack. That, at present, would be the most consistent form for their inference to take. Russell, Sir Marcos and Lady Drackroy should be thought of as having been attacked on the same side. Since Lady Drackroy has activated magic, it is a situation beyond Sir Marcos's lone hand. Roswal, either the enemy had quite the numbers, no. If they did something so blatant, the Royal Guard could not possibly have failed to sense signs of it. The enemy should also be a small, elite force. Russell, their aim would be the Empire's envoy, or else the kingdom's knights, or the werewolf being escorted. Roswal, there are still plenty who persist in such activities. After all, to the structure of Russell's reasoning, Roswal had little in the way of additions or objections. Amid the situation surrounding Marcos and Serena, the most likely targets for the yet unseen enemy to have fixed upon were Serena herself and the werewolf being escorted. Reasons for targeting the former were many and could be conjectured. For targeting the latter, it was more likely not the werewolf's life, but his liberation that was the aim. Since the demi-human war, overt clashes between humans and the demi-human tribes had vanished on the surface in the kingdom of Lugunica, but embers still smoldered here and there, and at times flared up as small blazes. However, Russell, involving the Empire's envoy this time cannot be dismissed as a small blaze. Roswal, if something happens to Serena, it will likely develop into a major diplomatic problem, all the more so if she were to lose her life in the kingdom. Russell, it could become a war with the Valatian Empire. At Russell's conclusion, Roswal nodded quietly. This was no exaggeration. As a matter of fact, the state of non-belligerence between the kingdom of Lugunica and the Valatian Empire was a miraculous span of time, sustained upon a very delicate balance. And there were surprisingly many who wanted to end this miraculous time and strike a decisive blow to the relations between the two nations. That was not limited to the warlike people of the empire. The same was true in the kingdom. It was a leap of thought. But if this incident were the work of demi-humans plotting the werewolf's liberation, then those who still harbored the grudge of the demi-human war and hated the kingdom might desire a slide into war brought on by a worsening of relations between kingdom and empire. Each was a bud of possibility with ample risk of avalanching toward the worst, Roswal, and I desire none of them to come to pass. Roswal L. Mathers had a plan, one that would take a very, very long time. It was a span of years that would make an ordinary person's head swim, and a one-time chance that would not allow failure. And he had not yet even reached the starting point. To surely bring it to fruition, any factor that would stop his feet had to be removed. Russell, the Royal Guard likely has not yet grasped the situation. I will contact them from my side. You, Roswal. Naturally, I'll move at once. Saying so, Roswal set a foot on the laboratory's window frame. With Russell's widened eyes at his back, he cast himself straight out into the air. And Russell, magic is far more out of the ordinary than I imagined. Glancing outside the window at Roswal, floating in midair wreathed in wind, Russell murmured. Russell, by the way, if I learn from you, will I be able to fly as well? Roswal, rather than if you learn from me, if you hone yourself, you can. So long as you judge your own aptitudes and are prepared to spend your entire life on magic, Russell. I see, so it will not be easy. Any leads on where to search? Roswal, for the time being, I'll try tracing the traces of Serena's magic. You, Russell cut him off. Then take this, and tossed something his way. Catching it on reflex, Roswal found it to be a folding hand mirror, and it was obvious it was not merely a tool for one's appearance. A conversation mirror, a meteor that enabled conversation between paired mirrors. Roswal, you miss nothing. Russell, that's my one redeeming feature. Do not overdo it, Roswal. Tucking the conversation mirror into his breast, Roswal waved a hand. Ah, to Russell's words. Then he rose in altitude, left the Institute's stone tower, and began to pursue the traces of Mana. It would be a problem if Serena were to suffer something through carelessness, and a war between kingdom and empire, not in his plan, were to break out. And Roswal, Serena and Marcos, too, are friends I would hate to lose, ate Serena. For now, it seems we have shaken off our pursuers. Leaving the mountain road, engulfed in explosions behind them, and slipping some distance into the deep forest to hide among the trees, Serena slackened her taut vigilance a little and rolled her shoulders. Soot and dirt smudged the formal dress of a noble's daughter she wore, but fortunately she had not suffered a single wound. That much was thanks to Serena's own handling of the situation and to the efforts of those around her. At the very least, there ought to be that much to show for it, that Serena had escaped unscathed. After all, Serena, when it comes to survivors on our side, it is down to me and you two now. Behind her, as she said so, 3 figures were likewise taking shelter behind the trunk of a great tree, resting their bodies. None of them were imperial soldiers. Regrettably, the 4 soldiers escorting Serena from the Empire had not made it out of that mountain road alive. Nor had the kingdom's 3 knights, the drivers, or the ground dragons. In the end, those who survived that place were Serena, the kingdom knights Marcos and Heinkel, Look, special envoy, the situation's pretty dire, so why are we dragging this guy along? Serena, I am aware I am asking something troublesome, but what I was ordered to do is escort that man back. If it is his Imperial Majesty's decree, I have no choice but to obey, do I? Heinkel. Even so, Alager. Your screws loose, you lot. Even in this untransformed, scrawny state, the werewolf Alager, hands bound in manacles, glared at Serena and the others without loosening a whit of the hostility and caution in his eyes. Finding that fierce hatred almost amusing, Serena curved her lips. Serena, sorry to say, but you are going to stick with us a little longer yet, Alager. Alager, you're bloody nuts, lady. He wrinkled his nose and spat the words. That they had managed to extract Alager, bound and all, in the midst of that chaos was a stroke of fortune bordering on the miraculous. From the look of it, the man whose life had been spared had not the slightest intention of being grateful. Serena, and to have my sanity questioned on top of that is unfair. I am your lifesaver, or ought to be. Alager, damn right we're questioning ya. Risking your own neck to haul me out of there, 'cause the Emperor told you to. Only thing to call that is crazy lady, drop dead. Heinkel, watch your tongue! It was not Serena but Heinkel who snapped at the werewolf's attitude, insolence taken to the extreme. The red-headed knight hardened his mild features and thrust an awfully grand-looking sword toward Alager. Heinkel, don't you get it? If the special envoy hadn't decided to save you, you'd still be back on that road right now. Alager. Either way I'm gettin', hauled back to the Empire to be executed. Try lookin' at the heart of it, rich boy. Heinkel, KH, why you? Heinkel raised his blade, face gone red at Alager's mockery. For a second it seemed his temper would end the mission then and there, but Heinkel. NNGH. His movement froze with the sword still raised. The hand gripping his weapon was clenched with abnormal force and trembled faintly. Winking one eye, Serena called out to him. Serena. Sir Knight Heinkel, that is far enough. We risked our lives to save that life. It would be laughable to cut it down with our own hands. Heinkel, if that is your order, special envoy. He answered, and with reluctant air slid his sword back into its scabbard. It was a farcical exchange, but Heinkel was one of the few people they still had. With the need for solidarity being absolute from here on, needless friction ought to be avoided whenever possible. Between his poor response under pressure and that trembling a moment ago, Heinkel's problems were not ones Serena could hope to solve here. Which was why, of those present, the person she most needed on her side was Marcos. Quit making the special envoy babysit you with that worthless back and forth. Heinkel, Marcos, keep your voice down. Where do you think we are, and what do you think we are doing? A low voice came from the shadow of the tree, and Heinkel squeaked. Irritated, Marcos rebuked him. Marcos had been there, tending to his wounds in that shade. He had suffered quite deep injuries trading blows with the assailants on the mountain road. Thanks to the first aid, the bleeding from the gashes across his thick, burly chest had stopped. Serena, that said, you must have bled a good deal. How do you feel, Marcos? I can move somehow. Your quick wit saved me, special envoy. Serena, No, quick wits and clever tricks only matter if there is a situation to make use of them. In that regard, Sir Knight Marcos's fighting was the lifeline for every last one of us. She shrugged, not offering comfort or encouragement but a candid evaluation. A deadly rear guard firing from afar, and two exceptionally powerful fighters at the fore. The enemy ambush on that mountain road had been near perfect. It would not have been strange if they had been annihilated with no room to act. With their means of travel destroyed in the opening move and her escort cut down, Serena had been cornered. She prided herself on being more resourceful than the average girl, and that she could wield a sword, but Serena did not delude herself into thinking that would get her through a pinch like that. Their continued survival was thanks to Marcos's efforts. There would be no laughing if the thin ice underfoot had given way. Serena, Sir Knight Heinkel as well, did not turn his nose up at me for being an imperial and followed orders. Thanks to that, the duty of escorting the werewolf can still continue. Heinkel. And no, special envoy, I only did what I should have. Marcos. Is this really the time to curry favor? Button it. About the flash you just used as a smokescreen. For a smokescreen it packed a lot of punch. That earring must have been a very valuable piece, no? Serena. I used it where it should be used. That is what tools are for. Quick to notice, Marcos had seen the missing earring. Serena touched the ear now bare and replied. It had been an ornament bestowed by the Valetian emperor in recognition of her quelling a revolt in her domain. But the stroke of luck was having learned the proper way to use it just yesterday. The method she had learned from Roswell during her visit to the Magic Research Institute. That was what had become a smokescreen far beyond excessive, buying them the opening to flee. Serena. If we were careless and the pursuers had died in that blast, the matter would be simple, but... Marcos. That is a long shot. Those bastards were skilled, every last one. Even if not, the ones at long range will not have been caught in it. Serena. True enough, I only said it. When they broke away under cover of the magic crystal's explosion, Marcos had left a very large parting gift to keep the sniper's head down. But counting on that having killed the target would be overly optimistic. For the time being, they should assume all three of the enemy assassins were still alive. Serena. We came down the mountain road and made it into the forest below, but how long will it take the kingdom to grasp the situation and send reinforcements? Heinkel. That, of course, as quickly as possible, the knights will respond. Marcos. We cannot say. What I can say is they were waiting for us fully prepared. That being so, there is a good chance they have already moved to keep word of the commotion from spreading. Serena. So banking on reinforcements and waiting out the pursuit is unrealistic. She nodded at Marcos's answer while ignoring Heinkel's vague one. It had been an ambush arranged with meticulous care. The problem was who had leaked that they would be passing through that place at that time, or rather, from which nation the leak had come. Depending on whether the fault lay with the kingdom or the empire, the depth of the problem changed for Serena. And then Heinkel, special envoy, I have a proposal. We hand that werewolf over to them. Serena. Oh. Raising a small hand and lowering his voice, Heinkel offered a proposal that made Serena arch a brow. It was the first time Heinkel had truly taken her by surprise, and it was also the most worth considering of his suggestions so far. Of course, all would depend on his intent. Heinkel. Those guys Marcos was fighting looked like demi-humans at a glance. If so, their aim is to free the werewolf. If we hand him over, we might have room to negotiate. Uog. Marcos. Heinkel. What the hell are you saying? Marcos suddenly flared up, fisting Heinkel by the chest mid-sentence. He lifted him with such strength that Heinkel's feet left the ground and glared at him from up close. Marcos. They killed the envoy's guards and they killed our own. And you want to hand the werewolf to them? What happens to the ones who died? Heinkel. I feel the same, but you're the one not getting it. Marcos, what was that? Heinkel. The envoy's safety comes first. That's what you said. He kicked his dangling feet, twisting at Marcos's hand with both of his own. The difference between their arms was like the trunk and a branch of a tree, yet the strength of conviction had them even for now. When all was said and done, Marcos's position was one of emotion, as someone whose own had been killed. His words lacked grounding. Heinkel's was a position that took diplomatic issues into account, though it, too, was short on certainty. If one had to say which of them had the better theoretical armor on in that moment, it would be Heinkel. However, Serena, that supposes their target really is a lagger. That is the weak point. Heinkel, you think it might be something else. Serena, easily. At the very least, so long as I am inside the kingdom, I am like a fire magic stone. Wherever I am detonated, some degree of damage will result. If the damage itself is what they are after, your proposal is irrelevant whether we hand a lagger over or not. If what the enemy wanted was simply for Serena to die in the kingdom, then Heinkel's proposal would be ignored, and there would be no room for negotiation. Or perhaps, taking Serena's life and freeing a lagger's person both would be the surest way to rub both empire and kingdom entirely the wrong way. Either way, Serena. Sir Knight Heinkel's valuable proposal is one where, if we try it and fail, there will be no recovering. On top of that, I will add one more thing. Heinkel, and that is, Serena, as I just said, this is His Imperial Majesty's decree. We risked our lives to pull a lagger out for that. If I return alive yet fail to fulfill that decree, I am not sure my head will remain attached. In short, from the very premise, Serena did not have the freedom to release a lagger. Hearing this, Marcos let Heinkel drop back to the ground, then raked his own head with his free hand. Marcos, which means we are cut off and on our own, with no reinforcements, and we kill every last pursuer and press on with the mission. Serena, at the limit, it would be good enough if we slipped the pursuit and made it to the border fortress. But depending on where the pursuers hail from, I cannot say the fortress will be safe. Marcos, you cannot say the fortress will be safe. Serena, I have many enemies, not only in the kingdom but within the empire as well. Add to that, my most immediate enemy is no, that is enough of that for now. She slowly shook her head and left it unsaid. Then, having listened in silence, a lagger suddenly rumbled deep in his throat. For a man in manacles, in a position as precarious as it got, it was a sullen smile. Their gazes turned his way, and he snorted. A lagger. Before we set out you were so high and mighty, but now your spot ain't so different from mine, huh? Maybe I oughta howl and bring 'em right to ya. Heinkel, WH, what did you say? A lagger. That gag slipped off in the chaos. Just sayin' I got options, right? Serena. There are always options. I do not particularly recommend that one. Hands on her hips, Serena stated it plainly. If it sounded like begging for life, she would not deny it, but that was not all. Serena. Given the situation, I do not think they are after your freedom. If that is so, what role are you expected to play just for being there? A convenient place to pin the blame. A lagger. Serena. An imperial envoy and the kingdom knights escorting her, wiped out to the last. As the culprit, the werewolf who was to be returned to the empire for execution. That is very convenient. As she laid out the logic, a lagger's expression gradually clouded. Serena was only voicing a possibility, yet she was confident the reasoning fit a lagger's position rather well. However, there was a decisive hole in her argument from a lagger's point of view. A lagger, I get it, sellin', you out don't save me even if I let 'em kill ya. But that's the same even if I don't sell ya out, innit? That was the hole. Even if a lagger threw in with them, made it to the fortress, and they managed to get the situation under control, what awaited him would be the scaffold. If he would die either way, Serena had no right to condemn him for trying to drag them down with him out of spite. Therefore, to collapse that premise, Serena. Quite so, which is exactly why there is room for you and me to negotiate. A lagger. Negotiate, huh, Serena? Yes, listen, a lagger. If you agree not to sell us out here, I am willing to declare you dead and let you go. Heinkel. Wah! Heinkel gasped, as did a lagger, at Serena's offer spoken with her arms folded. Only Marcos, with a face like bedrock, stared steadily at Serena as if to probe her. Marcos, I believe you only just said you could not go against His Majesty's decree. Serena, I did, but needs must. If a lagger howls and draws them down on us here, that is the end. In that case, to protect our own lives, shall I silence him? Marcos fell silent, and Serena smiled. Serena, I do not favor filthy tricks like that. You feel the same, I take it. To Serena, pride was something to be valued as highly as life itself, if not higher. Serena, And if I am to take both my life and my pride, the compromise in the middle is deceiving His Majesty. What do you say, Alagar? Alagar. Hard to answer that one. Serena, naturally, to report you killed rather than released, I will need convincing proof, an eye, perhaps, or an arm. In return, I will give you a way to live. That is my offer. Alagar. Serena. Apologies, but we cannot give you long to think. Sir Knight Heinkel is even more impatient than I am. She flicked a glance at Heinkel as she spoke. He blinked at her, then caught on immediately and drew his sword again. The gleam of steel gave the dithering Alagar a firm shove in the back. Alagar. Fine, I'll do it your way. Serena. Well done. Needless to say, even if they kill us, you will not be saved. So when it comes down to it, Alagar. Crazy lady. Grinding his teeth, Alagar looked at her with naked loathing. Serena laughed. Somehow, the rational talks with the werewolf had concluded. Whether she could really talk Dryzen Valatia, the Emperor, into accepting a lie was a gamble, but first they had to make it back alive. Watching Serena's profile as she finished the negotiation, Marcos let out a long breath. Marcos, now I get why you're pals with Roswal. Serena, oh, so you did know Roswal. You said nothing about it and let me talk. That is unkind of you, Sir Knight Marcos. Marcos, you and him and one more of Roswal's pals, you're all worse than I am. Serena, you mean Russell Fellow? In that case, I met him yesterday as well. Marcos, figures. The honorifics slipped from his words, and the respect from his demeanor. Marcos wore a face as though the world were ending. Smiling at his reaction, Serena looked up to the sky. The thick canopy blocked out the light. In the overgrown forest, no sunshine reached them. That was a tailwind for those who had to hide, like Serena's party, but if there was anyone besides the pursuers searching for them, it would be a headwind for that party. An idea struck her. Serena fished in her breast and played a thin, light thing between her fingers. Fortunately, blowing away the earring had also let her grasp a certain sense for it. Serena. So long as I do not throw away pride and dignity, I will use every measure I can. That is how I do things. While Serena was laying down an extra precaution just in case. Marcos, Heinkel, keep your eyes on the werewolf. The special envoy struck a deal with him, but I cannot say how seriously he took it. Testing the feel of clenching and unclenching his fist, Marcos gave Heinkel his orders. At this point, the question of who the squad leader was meant nothing at all. Heinkel answered that order with a grim face and a nod. Only, after that he shut his mouth and stared fixedly at Marcos, which Marcos could not make sense of. Marcos, what? Your staring's getting on my nerves. Heinkel, you're okay, right? I've never seen you press that hard before. Marcos, told you they were skilled. And it was 2-on-1, no, 3-on-1, counting the long-range shooter. Of course it took doing. Heinkel, Marcos, if we had more competent allies, it would be another story. Getting bilayed out by the special envoy's quick thinking, don't you think that looks pretty bad for a knight? Heinkel, that's? He still could not answer Marcos's needling with anything proper, which was tiresome. He had managed to talk back when Marcos lost his temper a moment ago, which had been a surprise, but now the man's lack of spirit made that look like a mistake. In any case, Marcos had no room to indulge Heinkel's self-doubts any further. Marcos, I'm the vanguard, you're the rear. At least be the first to spot the enemy. Heinkel, all right. Don't you lose. Tacking on an unnecessary extra comment, Heinkel headed over to Alagar and used his blade to keep the now docile werewolf in line. Watching that, Marcos once more dropped his gaze to his own hand. Marcos, in his vision, the fist that opened and closed was trembling ever so slightly. Bit by bit, the wound the arrowhead had gouged was throbbing in an ominous way, and it was downright unpleasant. 9 having taken off from the Royal Research Institute of Magic, Roswal followed the traces, relying on the spell pattern he had sensed. Magic crystals were pure crystallizations of mana. Serena's magic that had used one as a catalyst should have been quite powerful, but as expected, the traces had grown faint as time passed, making it hard to pin down an exact location. Thus, it seemed that tracing their steps would not be easy. But Roswal, was this Marcos's doing, as outrageous as ever? Saying so, Roswal looked exasperated at the overly conspicuous signs of battle he had discovered below. What lay there was a bizarre sight. A dragon carriage wedged into the cliff of a rocky mountain road. Even if an accident had sent a dragon carriage tumbling off the cliff, it would not end up like this. As seen, the proper conclusion was that someone had forcibly slammed the dragon carriage into the cliff and stuck it there. Roswell. The very notion of proper gets a bit fuzzy here. But there's really no one else. One would not say just anyone could perform such a feat, but if even a single likely candidate came to mind, it would not be wrong to call it within the realm of possibility. Roughly calculating the angle and line by which the dragon carriage had been hurled into the cliff, Roswell set his sights across the valley on the mountain road opposite and headed that way. And then, Roswell, kneeling on one knee on the mountain road, he ran his palm over the poorly leveled ground as he pondered. By Roswell's estimation, this mountain road was where Serena had cast her magic, and at the same time, where her escort Marcos had rampaged enough to throw a dragon carriage. Nevertheless, there was no sign of anything like that in the surroundings. Only the dragon carriage stuck in the cliff stood out, entirely out of place. It was a deeply puzzling sight, but either the dragon carriage in the cliff or the pristine mountain road was lying. Roswell, and in most cases, lies are used to prettify reality, convinced of this, Roswell snapped his fingers high in the middle of the mountain road. At once, a gust sprang up centered on Roswell, and it swept down the mountain road in one go. The next instant, unable to withstand the strong wind, the craftsmen who had adorned reality revealed themselves. They were Roswell. Bugs! In Roswell's field of view, what the wind had torn up and flung aside were innumerable winged insects with their wings folded. By camouflaging the surfaces of their wings as scenery and clustering together, the winged insects had fabricated a pristine mountain road. However, once the trick was exposed and the deception beneath became visible, what lay bare were cracks in the ground, a crumbled cliff, and the randomly tidied corpses of the dead. Roswell. Oh, in that split second, something grazed Roswell's navy blue long hair and shot past right beside him. Whipping his head around, Roswell grasped that this had been a shot aimed at him from afar. The moment he saw that the place where Marcos had hurled the dragon carriage and the place where the actual fighting had taken place were far apart, he had already been on guard for the presence of a sniper who required long-distance throws of super-heavy masses from Marcos. For that reason, he had donned a suit of wind as armor beforehand, prepared for a surprise attack. Thanks to it, he avoided a clean hit, but the fact that the wind's protection had nearly been pierced at the last instant was power beyond his expectations. Roswell, no wonder Marcos had trouble. If the foe had been ordinary, there would have been no reason Marcos's physical prowess could not have repelled them. If the enemy were grunts, Marcos would easily have subdued 1,000, 2,000. Therefore, this was a dire strait, namely, an elite. All things are moved by those who stand far above the rest. And Roswell did not think Marcos so poor a fighter as to fall behind an opponent who only shot from far away. Thus, when different bugs that had been plastered to the ground for the sake of a surprise attack rushed him next, he, without any preliminary motion, rose into the air and slipped past their ambush with ease. Roswell, if it's not a meteor that manipulates insects, then it's the work of the insect cage tribe. I don't like needless killing, but we're short on time, so I'll have to follow the order of priorities. Saying that, Roswell held his hand over the swarming, saw-blade-like bugs massed at his feet, and the flames he unleashed burned them away along with the swarm. Listening to the grating death cries of insects, Roswell turned his other hand to the open air and spread the conflagration to the winged insects that had been fabricating the mountain road as well. If the enemy belonged to the insect cage tribe that manipulated bugs, then to assume these were mere non-combat decoys used for camouflage would be to stop thinking. He would not stop thinking. On top of that, Roswell. Suddenly, an impact burst through the curtain of flame and struck Roswell. It was the enemy's second shot. After the first had been stopped by the wind armor, they immediately responded by using an arrow projectile with increased penetration. However, Roswell did not fall short when it came to adaptability either. The impact had been drawn into the center of his chest, but it had not penetrated Roswell's body. He had judged that, with this opponent, They would soon counter the wind armor and had prepared a stone breastplate beneath. Roswal. Right there. The instant the second attack struck, Roswal, inverted midair, grasped the general position of the sniper and brought his hand down toward it. Immediately, over the valley, in the area where the sniper was likely to be hiding, masses of flame came pouring down all at once. To strike an enemy whose position had been fixed, after blocking the opening salvo with wind armor, he had quietly prepared fireballs above the clouds. With nowhere to run, the carpet bombing would incinerate the foe. Roswal, putting maximum firepower into your opener is the basis of combat. Before the opponent could gather information, annihilating them with overwhelming firepower was the surefire method for a magician. In that regard, Roswal had been drilled mercilessly by his master. Of course, depending on the situation, he would choose tactics other than that, but as things stood, there was no reason to gainsay that teaching. He had burned away the bugs and scorched the sniper. Next, he would presumably rendezvous with Marcos and the others who must have fled into the forest. That was the moment. Roswal. I slipped up. Feeling a sharp blow bite into his left shoulder, Roswal realized his mistake. Was it the sniper's last show of grit, bathed as they were in the falling flames? The next shot they loosed did not aim straight at Roswal. Instead, they added a little twist to their aim. Correcting at once for the fact that a frontal strike had been blocked, the enemy attacked Roswal's back. In other words, they pulled off a trick shot by ricocheting it off a third kind of bug that had appeared in the sky, one bearing a carapace on its back. Thanks to the wind armor, the round was deflected. Even so, it was no mere graze one could laugh off. Roswal. Their allies will arrive soon. I can't Luwinger here. Pressing a hand to the gouged back of his left shoulder, Roswal decided to withdraw from the spot. It was a deep wound that needed tending, but if he lingered, he would invite enemy reinforcements. That would be fatal here. Roswal immediately lowered the altitude of his flight spell and descended toward the forest at the foot of the mountain road's cliff. He considered returning to the royal capital to report once, but even the sniper alone was an elite among elites. If he retreated with his safety in mind, Serena would, in all likelihood, be killed, and the countdown to war might begin. That was not what he wished, Roswal. For an instant he felt his head swim, and the control of Roswal's flight spell faltered. Surprised by what his body had done, Roswal clutched his wounded shoulder tight. The blood from the wound had not stopped, but the amount was not enough to cloud his consciousness. Nor had he trained so half-heartedly that pain of this degree would disrupt his control over magic. And yet, the flying Roswal was losing stability. Roswal. Poison! Realizing it too late, Roswal ground his molars. There was poison smeared on the sniper's projectile. The enemy was, in all likelihood, of the insect cage tribe, so the poison was probably insect-derived, making its properties hard to ascertain. From the feel of it, it did not seem the sort to kill instantly, but this was bad. Roswal. I can't knit my mana properly. Breath ragged. Roswal's altitude suddenly plunged. Now on a trajectory little different from gliding. Colliding with the branches and boughs of the forest, Roswal shielded his face with an arm, curled his body tight, and braced himself for impact with the ground. If the landing point was soft dirt, fine. If it was bare rock, it would be disastrous. Feeling the ground rush up, Roswal tensed every muscle stranger. Reckless bastard! Braced for a crash into the earth, Roswal was caught by something hard, but somewhat softer than his worst expectation, and greeted by a low voice. Blinking in surprise, he looked up and locked eyes with a boulder, with a face like a boulder. It was Roswal. He, Marcos. I felt you were in crisis, so I rushed over like thieves. Marcos, that your excuse when you just dropped out of the sky? If I hadn't caught you, you'd be a bloodstain on the ground right now. Roswal. Which means we're both supporting each other, right? Friendship is truly a beautiful thing, don't you think? Oh, Marcos. I don't. Saying something so cold, he let go and dropped Roswal to the ground. Snorting as he looked down at Roswal was Marcos, the man they were searching for. Apparently, he had dashed to the spot where Roswal was falling out of control to catch him. Ordinarily, if one reached out for a falling Roswal with that much momentum, the one catching would not come out unscathed either. but it would be boorish to say that to Marcos. As Roswal was feeling relieved to have linked up with Marcos, Serena, "Oh, if it isn't Roswal. Have you, after all, found it hard to part with me? In that case, let us head for the Empire together, and you may become my consort." With the sound of grass and brush being pushed aside, Serena stepped from between the trees. Upon finding Roswal, she flashed a gallant smile. She was imposing, and at a glance it was neither bravado nor did she appear to be wounded. That, it seemed, was where Marcos had staked his pride as a knight and protected her to the last. "Roswal, I must refuse the marriage proposal. Buat, I am very glad my new friend is safe. Are you two the only ones alive?" "Marcos, no, the werewolf we were escorting and a royal guard squad leader are with us. Neither is easy to count as fighting strength, though, better keep an eye on a lagger so he doesn't run." "Serena, I could not care less how you evaluate Heinkel. As for the opinion that he's useless, I agree." At Serena's reply, Marcos answered with a look that said he had a lot of thoughts about it. At their exchange, Roswal, for the moment, patted his chest in relief that the worst possibility, failing to make it in time, had been avoided. Now, without despairing, they needed to probe for a way to escape this situation. Serena. "Right. Roswal, the spell you taught me came in handy. No matter the circumstance, when what you've learned comes alive, it's exhilarating." For a heartbeat, Roswal drew in a breath at Serena's beaming words, then let out a laugh. He agreed wholeheartedly and thought she was exactly right. But Roswal, there's a limit to how out of place you can be. Honestly, you're such a friend worth saving. You knew, Serena. "I see. If it's true that you took down that sniper, then there are 2 elites left on the enemy's side, are there not?" Roswal. "Ah, that should be the Cassie. If they also took Marcos's parting gift, it's hard to imagine they dodged all of my flames." Ow, could you dress it a little more gently?" Marcos. "Don't start whining after you put yourself out on the front line." So saying, Marcos, who had dressed the wound in Roswal's left shoulder, gave him a smack on the back. At the utter lack of mercy in that palm, Roswal let out a GRH in his throat and glared at Marcos resentfully. To take risks to come save him and even suffer an honorable wound and receive this attitude. This friend was, indeed, one with little worth saving. "Roswal, for how frankly she gives thanks, Serena outranks you as a friend even though it's been but a short while." "Serena, from what I'm seeing, the two of you seem to have quite the easy rapport yourselves. And as I've said more than once, I also have the ulterior motive of taking you as my consort." Roswal, to be so incorrigible in this situation, this isn't merely about having nerves of steel. Arms folded, Serena gave a sly grin, to which Roswal could only wryly smile. She truly had some guts. It was hard to think of her as a tragic princess whose life was being targeted. Having finished exchanging information, Roswal was newly impressed by Serena's strength. In practice, her quick thinking had let her escape the assassin's surprise attack in that moment of peril. And then, by casting magic, she had alerted Roswal as well. Her resourcefulness was outstanding. One might almost feel sorry for the attackers when Serena was playing so many best moves. Even so, the situation was one in which it was eat or be eaten. They also had an aim of preventing the outbreak of war. Mercy and pity should be reserved until the time came to hang them over the enemy's gravestones. "Russell, I understand the circumstances. However, even hearing them makes me want to frown." Thus said Russell, rubbing the space between his brows with a finger from within the small hand mirror. At present, by means of a pair of mirrors through which one could converse. The conversation mirrors. Roswal's group was linked with Russell, who had remained in the royal capital. Having him participate in the exchange of information with Serena and the others meant the situation on their side had been shared in full. Hence, it was only natural that Russell would want to knead out the furrow in his brow. "Roswal, to add one more thing, the condition of the wound the sniper dealt me is not good. It seems they smeared poison on it, and I'm experiencing malfunctions when using magic." "Russell, even worse. Are you likely to die?" Roswal, "Even if it's a lethal poison, it's likely a slow-acting one. With proper treatment, the prospects of survival are high. However, to administer proper treatment..." Marcos, "We'll have to wring out of that lot what poison it is." In a heavy tone, Marcos solemnly picked up Roswell's conclusion. It was, however, a mildly surprising statement. After all, the one who had suffered from the poison was Roswell. Roswell, from your standpoint, your top priority should be Serena's safety, should it not? I didn't think you'd concern yourself with me, the one who got poisoned. Marcos. Unfortunately, it's not someone else's problem. At Marcos's answer, his cheek twisted. Roswell knit his brows. Then Marcos raised his arm and from the gap in his armor at his left side, showed a blood-seeping wound. Roswell could not see his own left shoulder wound clearly either, but the bluish-black discoloration looked the same. Marcos. I've got this prickly feeling in my fingertips. I thought it might just be in my head, but… Roswell. I understated it, but I very much feel I've been dosed with a rather dangerous poison. Size difference or not, the way your body is built is truly monster class. Marcos. Maybe you're just freakishly frail. Russell. I'm not taking Roswell's side, but given the nature of assassins, using a poison that has no effect would be meaningless. The odd one out is Sir Marcos. With Russell's assistance, the weight of reason in this scene tilted toward Roswell. That said, receiving only a single click of Marcos's tongue as recompense was far from the sweet wine of victory. Comparing the wounds of Roswell and Marcos in turn, Serena closed one eye and said, Serena. So there are two victims of the poison. From what I've just heard, this doesn't sound like something that can be overcome by sheer grit. In that case, how do we bring down the assassins? Before the two self-reported victims, Serena sought opinions on a countermeasure. But to her words, a moment, please, came Russell's interjection from beyond the mirror. Russell, as I said earlier, the top priority is the life of Special Envoy Drakray. All the more so if Roswell and Sir Marcos have but little time left because of the poison. You must not misjudge your priorities. Marcos. You sure know how to say we've got little time left. Roswell. Truly, you're a friend with so little worth saving, aren't you? Russell. Sharp tongues you may have, but a Roswell who cannot use magic and a Sir Marcos who cannot put in strength are good for nothing but alleviating boredom. If it's that role, I can fulfill it even through the mirror. Serena. So you're telling us to abandon the two and go? An amusing opinion, that. With a small snort and a wry smile, Serena continued, however, and then said, Serena, Russell fellow, I understand your point. I would like to think I am not so foolish I don't grasp the impact my life has on those around me. On top of that, leaving behind two people being eaten away by poison is not an option for me. Russell. May I ask your reason? Serena. It's simple. If I return home without knowing who orchestrated this situation, I will meet an end no different from being poisoned again. To Russell's cold, clear-cut point, Serena replied with a resolute air. Receiving that, Russell on the other side of the mirror narrowed his eyes, and Roswell closed one of his as well. Poison? Thus did Serena speak of the dire straits to which she had been driven. Whether poison had actually been administered was not the issue. In her view, a situation in which poison could be administered at any time was already tantamount to having been poisoned. And that was an absolute iron-blooded law in the Valatian Empire, a nation of survival of the fittest. Serena. Besides, not to put too fine a point on it, but I don't think I'll shake pursuit with just myself and a single chatty mirror after abandoning the two. Even if you say you can't use magic and you can't put strength into it, surely you're not going to whine that you're completely useless, are you? Roswell. Well, I'm at about half of peacetime capacity. At Serena's provocative gaze, Roswell answered while checking the state of his body. Then, casting a glance at Marcos, he, too, let out a deep sigh. Marcos. I can still move a bit more than that. That said, with those kinds of elites as our opponents, we can't be optimistic. Russell. Even so, we have no choice but to have you win. We are also petitioning the Royal Guard to dispatch reinforcements from our side, but there are not many with your level of prowess. Roswell. In that case, Marcos will have to get promoted quickly, and will need to hurry the raising of the knight's baseline strength. Marcos. Big mouths, the both of you. Marcos snorted, tersely pushing away the opinions of Roswell and Russell. At any rate, Serena's resolve was firm. Russell abandoned the passive plan dressed up as rational, and withdrew his objection in favor of the policy of actively sweeping aside the sparks flying at them. In truth, Serena's thinking was correct. What must be won cannot be won without fighting. If the one whose station most demands valuing her life would meet them halfway, then Roswal and the others could only answer in kind. Roswal, not least because I can't very well die in a place like this myself. For the sake of the grand objective he envisioned, for the plan he had long spent time preparing, Roswal could not gallantly throw away his life for his homeland here. Roswal, Russell will do everything we can on our end. I'm counting on you on yours as well. Russell, I will do my utmost. I always do. Nodding at the reply of his reliable friend beyond the mirror, Roswal tucked the conversation mirror into his breast and slowly looked around at Marcos's and Serena's faces. And then, Roswal, all right then, let's work hard so that every last one of us makes it out alive. 11 Alagar felt a deep sympathy for the red-haired knight pointing a sword at him. Heinkel Astria of the Astria family line, that sword saint household, a man who had, for a father and a mother respectively, the sword demon and the sword saint, one of a bloodline inheriting legend from generation to generation. He was born to what seemed a guaranteed glorious future, yet for all that, he was a man who gave off a scent of ill fortune. Even his fellow knights treated him offhandedly. Even to Alagar, with the troublesome birth of a werewolf, he looked like he was living as if gasping for air. Of course, if Alagar said such sympathetic things out loud, he would only anger the man, who lacked composure and leisure, and it would turn into a bother, so he did not. In any case, Heinkel, don't move. If you try anything funny, you won't live. Alagar, told that crazy woman the same thing, didn't I? I'm not gonna try anything funny. Heinkel, don't talk. You werewolves have a reputation for slyly tricking people. Even if you act meek, no one can tell what you're thinking deep down. Alagar, you're the one who started talking to me. Not incoherent, but far too emotionally unstable. That said, considering Heinkel's situation, this lack of composure was understandable. There was a non-zero chance the enemy's target was Alagar, and yet the two of them had been left alone in the forest. While keeping watch on their surroundings, Heinkel had seen something in the forest sky. Serena and Marcos had gone to check it, but it was highly likely they were using that as a pretext to talk about something they did not want him to hear. The more time that passed like that, the worse Heinkel's complexion grew. Rising anxiety and tension, the nature of that impatience was obvious. Alagar, you're suspecting you've been abandoned and left behind, aren't you? Heinkel, shut up. Alagar, shut me up all you like, it won't change the facts, and it'd be a pain if you blew up at me while I kept quiet. If they were gonna abandon you, they'd use you as a decoy in a way that's a lot easier to understand, so don't worry. Heinkel, don't talk like you know. Alagar, I do know. Want me to teach you how hard life is for wolfmen and werewolves? At Alagar's low voice, the on the verge of exploding Heinkel choked on his words. This red-haired knight with such imagination seemed to have let his thoughts run with Alagar's last remark. How awful that imagining had been, Alagar did not know, but even so it was probably still soft. That was the fate of Alagar's kind, cursed from the moment they were born into this world. Alagar, compared to getting poked with a sword and forced to be a decoy, being left behind is nothing. If anything, that can even be called kind. Heinkel, being abandoned is kind. Alagar, being used is a loss of freedom, but if you're abandoned, what comes after is freedom. No matter how bad the situation, no matter how short the time, freedom has value, doesn't it? He had seen his kin, their fangs and claws sealed, die like bundles of straw, in the blink of an eye, time and again. Alagar's parents and siblings had died to no purpose, unable to hope for anything in the end. Compared to that, even if he were thrown onto a battlefield where death was the only outcome, the fact that he could wield his own strength for his own sake made it a far better way to live and die. However, in response to Alagar's words, there came a small, dry popping sound. Heinkel, I disagree. I don't think being abandoned is kind. He spat the words like something vile, and actually spat something from his mouth. Catching the faint smell of blood and seeing it was a shard from a broken tooth, Alagar understood that Heinkel had clenched so hard he had cracked a molar. Apparently, Alagar had stepped on some unbearable sore spot of Heinkel's. Even that, from Alagar's point of view, still felt like a coddled hell. But Alagar, comparing hells only makes things emptier, doesn't it? Licking wounds by comparing the abundance of misfortune. That sort of thing wasn't something you could do without alcohol. With that sentiment, Alagar sighed and noticed that the smell of people was drawing near. "Serena, you seem to have been good children. I've come back with a souvenir." So saying, with a smile-tinged joke, Serena returned. She would have been the youngest of them. No, that premise might have been wrong. For Serena had come back with Marcos and with another boy they did not know. Heinkel, special envoy. That man, is he one of the enemy? Seeing the boy, Heinkel, who had relaxed for an instant at Serena and the others' return, had his voice crack. At once Marcos snorted "Chen," as if to mock him. "Marcos, don't bark at everything that moves. First of all, you think I'd have trouble with a flimsy runt like this. Roswal, you do say things, don't yow, and while it's true I suffered a stinging defeat in our first bout, I'd say I put up quite a good fight in the rematch afterward, wouldn't you?" "Marcos, don't make this more complicated than it is. This is the Margrave Mathers. Seems he rushed here to help. He's the one who saw you cross the sky." Heinkel, M. Margrave. "My apologies." At the boy, at the person introduced as the Margrave, hunching his slender shoulders, Heinkel went pale yet again and went down on one knee. The Margrave waved a hand no to the kneeling Heinkel with a friendly smile, then turned his heterochromatic gaze this way. There was something about that look that made one ill at ease, and the depths of Alagar's belly crawled. "Roswal, you're the werewolf in question, are you? I've heard about the deal with Serena. Can I expect things from you as well, lol? Alagar, if you can trust a werewolf, sure. But if you ask me, the very moment you've gotten to the option of borrowing a werewolf's hand, the odds of defeat are already heavy." Roswal, well said. It may be hard to call that a cooperative stance, but regardless of whether your character is trustworthy, surely we can trust your desire to survive, can't we? Nodding at his snarl, the Margrave wore a crafty smile beyond his years. Seeing that smile, which chilled the viewer to the bone, Alagar felt, toward him, a wariness he had not felt toward Serena or Marcos, and certainly not toward Heinkel. It was a warning that this youthful Margrave was the one who most instinctively stirred a sense of crisis. Be that as it may, Heinkel, you're not going to run, you're going to meet them head-on. Are you serious? Roswal, serious as serious can be. They're the ones who laid an ambush. They've surely grasped the surrounding terrain and prepared their methods of pursuit. There's little chance we win if it turns into a chase. Heinkel, but Marcos lost. If we go at them head-on as well. Marcos didn't lose. The Margrave here cut our pursuers by one. When there were three, their coordination pushed us back, but with two, the situation changes. We've got allies, too. Not you, Heinkel, I know that without you saying it. Marcos don't know it. Hearing the policy and plan Serena and the others had brought back, Heinkel's agitation grew intense. But listening at his side, Alagar agreed with Heinkel. If all you considered was survival, the best plan was Serena making for the fort with the others as decoys. And yet, smiling at that perfectly natural line of thought, Serena said this. Serena, if I let them have their way and don't repay it, even if my life isn't taken, I die. If I show my pride, then even if I am killed, I will not die. Alagar. At Serena's imposing answer, Alagar clenched his molars and fell silent. Because he was made to think anew that she was a woman who was hideous, one who made his skin crawl. 12. In the depths of the forest, the poor footing and worse visibility served only to benefit an opponent launching an ambush. To break through such adverse conditions, Roswal's scheme was bold and ridiculous. Roswal, I rained fireballs down on the battlefield. The enemy has surely already realized that there was reinforcements, me. Which is to say, it's only a matter of time before full-fledged reinforcements arrive, not just us. The poison has begun to creep through them as well. Neither side can take long. Marcos, so you're saying it's fine to advertise our location out in the open? Roswal, a short, decisive battle is exactly what they want too. They've already cornered us once and know they're superior in raw ability. There's no reason they wouldn't take the bait, is there? Marcos, fine. I'll take that provocation. Implicitly reminded that they had once been driven to the brink, Marcos twisted his cheek and nodded. In fact, Marcos agreed with Roswal's read. The enemy wanted to finish them as quickly as possible. If there was one more push to be had toward that end, they would take it without flinching. Therefore, Uluzo, hey, honestly, what outrageous things you lot have gone and done. Bellowing thus, the man wreathed in a silver tail, Uluz, burst in just as Marcos finished brute-forcing the battlefield into shape. If one looked down on this forest from above now, there would surely be a bald patch yawning open. Across this whole stretch, precious great trees that looked 100 years old or more included, Marcos had ripped them up with his arms, mowed them down, and flattened the ground. Uluzo, you spared us the trouble of searching, but my, what recklessness. Jimrak, you did this alone. Frightening. At the forcibly cleared woodland, Uluzo let out a shrill cackle, and from behind him, Jimrak bared a narrow sliver of emotion. Surprise, to the words of the two assassins, a small weaponkin and a gigantic steelman, Marcos nodded with an yeah. Marcos, I did it, seeing as the other guy was just watching and being useless. Roswal, useless, is it? I bring the brains and you bring the brawn. Sounds like nothing more than the right tool for the right job, doesn't it? And besides, where I'm useful starts now. Trading barbs, Roswal, who had been using a felled tree as a chair, stood. When he lined up beside Marcos, the 2 versus 2 tableau was complete, just as planned. Glaring steadily at their foes, Marcos kept the man at his side, Roswal, in mind. It was both impressive and exasperating, but things had unfolded exactly as Roswal had laid out. The needlessly ostentatious tree felling to make a battlefield hadn't just been to keep the enemy from choosing terrain in their favor. There was one more aim, to verify that the sniper's elimination was certain. Roswal, we made such a show of our position and removed the forest that served as cover, root and branch. Had the sniper been alive, Marcos's back would have been the perfect target to shoot. Which means, Marcos, we assume the sniper's down, 80% odds that's the case. Roswal, splendid. Finding the attitude obnoxious, Marcos nonetheless kept a tight rein on himself. He did not discard the possibility that the enemy had simply not taken the obvious bait, and he would not let his guard down. The enemy was right there. He would turn this pent-up frustration that way. Roswal, just to confirm, do you intend to talk about the mastermind and their aims? Uluzo, a question indeed. And why would we be the ones to speak? We might deceive, but we would not disclose. It won't change what either of us has to do. Roswal, good vibes, tight lips. Looks like you're properly the enemy. Whether their target had been Serena's life or a lagger's release remained unknown. Roswal had not expected much from asking. Marcos answered the shrug with one of his own. There was just one point on which they agreed with their foes. Whatever it was, what they had to do did not change. Jimrak, no time for you, for us. Uluz, indeed. That's why we leaped at this clear invitation. Your goal and ours align. Let's do this in a way that's easy to grasp. The poison, as Roswal called it, was infecting everyone present at the same time. If time's passage would eat away at things like lives and fates, then neither side should drag this out. Above all, Marcos's patience was nearing its limit. Outmaneuvered in the first bout, taunted as a loser dog by Roswal, his fighting spirit was erupting. Roswal, I didn't say loser dog per se, Marcos. Shut it. Cutting off Roswal's excuse in a single, curt line, he faced the enemy. And then Marcos, I'll beat you senseless. Roswal, come at me in an instant. Triggered by a line from Marcos and one from Roswal, hostilities broke out. The first to move was the steelman Jimrak. That demi-human of a gigantic frame and super-heavy mass, belying his ponderous-looking exterior, flicked up his foot with agility, and then he sent the Uluzo beside him rocketing toward them with a tremendous kick. Uluzo. Ha, first, a little warm-up. Hurtling through the air, Uluzo began to spin. Wrapping his silver tail about himself lengthwise, he became a silver disc of slaughter whose edge could shear even a greatsword. In response, they Roswal. A warm-up would be too lax. I intend to finish this right away, ye. Uluzo. Nuna. The instant Roswell snapped his fingers, the leveled forest floor heaved, and pillars of earth surged up with tremendous force, clamping down on the oncoming silver disk from both sides. Uluzo, a trifle, a trifle. Even in the abnormal situation of being pinched midair by the earth itself, Uluzo forced a breakthrough by accelerating his spin further and grinding down the earthen pillars. At which point, Marcos, you broke my sword, and you'll pay for it. With a powerful step, Marcos swung the great tree he held with all his might and smashed a ferocious horizontal blow into Uluzo. The weaponkin, demi-humans who wield parts of their own bodies as weapons, a rare race alongside the steelmen. Uluzo's silver tail was the very mark of the weaponkin. Each such person was born with armaments to rival a master craftsman's blade, a point of pride for the race. Even so, that fearsome disk of slaughter had a weakness. Against a vertically spinning attack, a strike from directly side-on could not be swallowed up. Uluzo, Guff! Clobbered by the great tree, Uluzo let out a strangled cry and was blasted away at the speed of a cannonball. He plowed into the trees beyond the leveled ground, and the silver disk vanished even from the edge of sight. It looked like a child's game of whacking a stone with a stick, but the force and momentum were on an entirely different scale, and letting that spectacle hold one's gaze could be fatal. Jimrak, Owl Jimrak, Gwar. The latter half of his partner's name was burned away by the flames that engulfed Jimrak's head. Wreathed in fire across his gigantic frame, Jimrak thrashed and crashed over with a roar. And eyes still fixed on Jimrak, Roswell, who had done it with flawless execution, said Roswell, Marcos, as arranged. Marcos, don't mess it up. With that exchange, Marcos went after Uluzo, whom he had hammered into the forest. Steelman and weaponkin. After analyzing the pursuer's traits, Marcos and Roswell had decided to split their foes up this way. Not strength against strength and technique against technique, but strength against technique and technique against strength. If they both made full use of their strengths, there was no reason for Marcos to lose. As for Roswell, Marcos trusted his strength too. He would not lose. Therefore, Marcos did not do anything so foolish as to follow Uluzo into the trees. To make full use of the battlefield he had prepared, Marcos chose to attack by hurling projectiles. Not pebbles, mind you, but earthen spears that Roswell had fashioned Marcos. Eat this! The spears he'd made were each as thick as a child's torso, and hurled from Marcos's hand, their force was enough to shatter the walls of a middling fort in just a few shots. And thanks to Roswell's largesse, 20 of them went flying toward Uluzo. Ooh! Shockwaves gouged the earth, blew away trees, and reshaped the forest. From what he'd seen in the first clash, and now the second, Uluzo's silver tail had terrifying destructive power, but it required a certain amount of winding up to unleash it. So Marcos denied him that, pouring in one-sided attacks from a range where his foe could not reach. This would shave away the enemy's reserves, and if fortune smiled, bring him down Marcos. What? Without stopping, hurling earthen spears, Marcos noticed something amiss. The forest was being destroyed by the collateral force of his barrage aimed at Uluzo. But along with that, a distinctly different, brand-new destruction had begun to bloom. A shrill, grating metallic whine. Homing in on that sound, Marcos sent a spear straight in, and Uluzo, first off, let me apologize. Sorry for misleading you. And then, let me make sure you don't get the wrong idea. Never was I holding back. His declaration overlapped the crash as the spear was crushed head-on. With a metal-splitting screech and a spray of dazzling sparks, Uluzo burst out of the ruined forest. His body, with the silver tail wrapped around it, whirling every which way, become a silver sphere. Uluzo. This drains me fast. That's why. It's my trump card. Tusk. The unstoppable silver sphere tore mercilessly through each additional earthen spear. Every part of the sphere was a keen edge. It had overcome the weakness that had existed when it was a disc, and became a perfect attack form that minced every oncoming menace to bits. Marcos. R-R-R-O-O-O-H. To meet it head-on, Marcos, in the instant the last spear shattered, raised his fist. Aiming at the center of the incoming silver sphere, he unleashed a blow with all his might. Marcos's fist, which ripped the wind, erased the sound, and reduced whatever it struck to splinters. Japanese letter at that very instant. A pain in his side he could not ignore tightened his cheek, and the fist that touched the silver sphere spurted blood, almost simultaneously. 13, at the very same moment Marcos's fist burst against Uluzo's trump card silver sphere. Roswal. Well now, color me impressed, E. Narrowing his heterochromatic eyes at the sight before him, Roswal let his fighting spirit quietly tremble. The plan to split the two enemies and meet them each in their area of specialty had been proceeding smoothly. Marcos would overpower the weaponkin who pressed them with mobility and breakthrough force, using his monster-class strength. Roswal would elegantly cook the steelman clad in his innate heavy armor with magic. It was a strategy where honed skill and mutual trust would seize victory, and in practice it had been working. Up until just a moment ago, Jimrak, heard me, magicians troublesome, kingdoms. Roswal, from where I'm standing, you're the far more troublesome one-y. Answering so, Roswal gave an exaggerated shrug. Before him, Jimrak, who spoke in that weighty voice, slowly transformed. Jimrak's body had originally seemed made of a dull-hued mineral. That mineral nature shifted, and though the color remained, it turned into a smooth, metallic substance. In chunks, the once angular outer surface flaked away like scabs, and beneath it a new body emerged. And that body was Jimrak. Gwar! A small fireball Roswal loosed to test it hit Jimrak as if drawn in, only for the next instant, the fireball to reflect off Jimrak's skin and set some of the trees Marcos had felled alight. Thankfully, it wouldn't turn into a forest fire, but in every other respect, the wind was against Roswal. What the altered Jimrak had acquired was a physique with the property of reflecting magic, mana. That Gwar had been at test spec, but if he reflected not only more of them but ones with greater firepower in that fashion, a large-scale blaze or an accidental friendly hit would be unavoidable. Roswal. It's true there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to demi-human traits, but this is a bit short on reference materials, isn't it, Master? Unable to weave mana to perfection, and now facing a steelman whom magic would not take, Roswal wetted his lips. Feeling the plan collapse and the crisis rising, he opened and closed his fist. Jimrak, dangerous, you very, countermeasures perfect me. To Roswal's sense of crisis, the steelman charged without breaking his mechanical posture. Even with his body's construction transformed, his agility remained. That mighty, colossal arm rose high, and as Roswal met it head-on, he, with resolve, wove his magic. Unanticipated trial by fire or not, he would break through with the power of the magic to which he had devoted his soul. 14 Serena. It's begun. From far away, the abnormal thunder rolling to her ears served as Serena's notice that battle had been joined. As planned, Roswal and Marcos had succeeded in luring the assassins out. It was proof that Marcos's ludicrous, brute force clear-cutting of the forest had functioned. Honestly speaking, it was such a ridiculous plan she wanted to see it with her own eyes when put into practice. But this was the role she had decided to carry out even at the cost of that indulgence. Failure was not an option. Serena, you made me exercise restraint. Alagger, if you want to live, move your tail. Alagger, talkin' high and mighty, aren't ya? Muttering with spite, Alagger turned his head, sniffing with a snuffle. Even without transforming, a werewolf's sense of smell was as keen as a dogman's. Using that overwhelming nose, Alagger had been ordered to search for what they sought. Alagger was earnestly scenting the air, while on his back the watcher Heinkel had a sword leveled. Though wary of Alagger, he was having his focus shaken by the sounds of fighting reaching them. Each time there was a louder noise, the sword tip wavered, in danger of slicing into Alagger's back. Serena, don't be so tense. Whether you flail or not, when it's time to die, you die. Heinkel, don't say something so ill-omened. I can't afford to die, Serena. So you have a reason to survive beyond a simple survival instinct. Heinkel, survival instinct? I have a son. He's only 5 and he still can't properly tell right from wrong. My wife is bedridden with illness. Without me, my family. As Heinkel haltingly laid out his circumstances, Serena closed one eye. She knew that Heinkel was of the Astrea line, that famed, sword saint house of the kingdom. But even she had not ranged so far as to know about a wife and child. In any case, hearing that he had such circumstances made even his excessive self-protectiveness understandable. The presence of family was that great, both as a treasure and as a shackle. As expected of the Astria house, Heinkel had promise physically as well. He was blessed with a fine build, and even in his posture one could see results befitting someone who had undertaken a certain degree of training. On the other hand, his mind and body were so imbalanced it was worrisome. Put simply, because Heinkel's heart was brittle, he could not properly wield that body of his. Marcos's seeming harshness toward Heinkel, Serena felt, also stemmed from that kind of frustration and vexation. Serena prided herself on being a promising talent scout for the future. Whether she wanted Heinkel or not, she itched to do something about talent going to waste. But a lagger. "Oi, found it!" Sniffing, a lagger called to Serena and the others in a voice that brimmed with certainty. He jerked his chin lightly, indicating the direction where the target odor lay. To that result, Serena nodded. "Good work," and said, "Serena, we go. I hope Roswal and the others can win according to plan, but depending on what hole cards the enemy has, it wouldn't be strange for it to get flipped on us. In that case, they'll need our help. Heinkel, but Marco's losing. Serena, there's no such thing as impossible. Even if you're the strongest being in the world, this world is one where you can lose your life in the blink of an eye." Gently chiding Heinkel, who was placing a perilous degree of trust in Marcos's strength, Serena spoke. A mere few years ago, in Valetia's great city of Garkla, a former great hero lost his life. Kurgan of the 8 arms, sung of in legend, even such a being could have his life taken by unreasonable calamity in this world. The end of that legend had brought Serena great heartache. Not that it was the cause, but from then on, Serena had all the less held life as something absolute. Heinkel, even so Marcos, he's the real. Even after hearing Serena's words, Heinkel's trust in Marcos, no, at this point it was close to faith. Heinkel could not let go of that faith. Prodding his back to get him moving, Serena trusted a lagger's nose and slipped through the forest. Passing through the gaps between the trees and taking to a rock face, before long Heinkel. "Found it!" Seeing the same thing on the slope as Serena did, Heinkel raised a high voice. That whole area had been burned clean by Roswal's flames. The rock face was black and charred. The glimpse of Roswal's handiwork, who had burned so wide a swath, made her keenly feel the difference between herself, who had paid with a magic crystal, and a high-level mage. What they found was a single charred corpse, lying at the end of that mountain road. One of the attacker's band, the troublesome sniper. That corpse was what Serena and the others were searching for. "Serena, search the baggage for medicine. Keep watch around us." Leaving those words with Heinkel, Serena ran up to the corpse and quickly examined it. The body was badly burned, but not to the point that its belongings had been destroyed. If that was the case, then there was a decent chance that an antidote for the poison given to Roswal and the others, or at least a clue useful for identifying the type of poison, remained. So she thought when Serena... No! Turning the face-down body over, Serena realized it. This corpse was not the sniper. This was the body of the imperial soldier who had come to the kingdom with Serena and should have died on the mountain road. "Serena, Sir Hein!" Her hasty call was forcibly cut off by an attack from afar. Serena, "GH!" luring out her prey and shooting them through when they were full of openings, the basic tactics of a hunter. Caught cleanly, the impact that took her in the right breast passed out her back, and Serena toppled over backward. Heinkel, "Ah!" Seeing Serena topple helplessly, Heinkel's blue eyes went wide as he froze. That, too, was a sight a sniper would drool over and put him at the top of the list for the next victim. Just like that, Heinkel would be the next to fall to the sniper's shot, and then Serena. "Heinkel," Heinkel, "Special Envoy," called to by a trembling voice, the frozen Heinkel's face snapped back to life. Heinkel came running in a flustered, fumbling gait, and Serena, coughing a rough ehaf, grabbed the red-haired knight by the lapels. "Serena, the mountain road across. Finish him. Heinkel, be but Special Envoy your wound. Serena, go. Heinkel Astria, Heinkel. Serena, you're going back to your family, aren't you? Kill the enemy, fulfill your duty." Heinkel, who had tried to talk back, was struck full in the face by Serena's bellow. Her shout made her bones creak, and her organs screamed. Even so, she did not let any of it show. She would not let anything get in the way of driving Heinkel on, burned by Serena's blazing gaze. At length, Heinkel, mouth opening and closing, turned with his face slick with cold sweat. Gripping the sword he had been clutching tight all along, he shifted his hold, and Heinkel, "Oh, ay. Letting out a voice that flipped high, he charged like a shot onto the mountain road where the enemy lay. His speed unbelievably fast, as if that hesitance until now had been a lie. Serena, see, you can do it, cough, seeing that back drawing away. Serena finally allowed her face to twist in pain. There was no second round from the sniper for Heinkel, who was dashing down the mountain road, nor for her, half dead. The enemy was fumbling. Likely they weren't unscathed either. If so, there should be enough of a chance, even for the newly spurred Heinkel. And then a lagger. You think he can handle it alone? He'll just die. Serena, which one? Me left behind with the werewolf we were transporting? Or the knight Heinkel who went to kill a sniper half dead himself? A lagger. At this rate, both. How'd you cheat death? Serena, how rude. I told you my life is your life as well. Didn't I? You ought to be relieved. Glad I'm still alive. A lagger. Big mouth on a crazy woman. What you wrap around your chest? Serena. A gift from a friend. Atop the charred rock face, a lagger stood. To his question, Serena's chest, beneath the torn clothing from the shot, showed her undergarments, and quite different from that, shining silver threads. It was the silver thread that Roswal had given her yesterday as a souvenir from the Royal Research Institute of Magic. If you poured mana into it, it freely changed form. Serena had wound it tightly around her torso. Wound, and willed it to become as hard as possible, the silver thread functioned as a beautiful light cuirass. Its strength was not that great, to be sure. Though it had prevented a fatal wound, the penetrating force it had failed to kill might have broken ribs and ruptured organs. Serena. Only, the side benefit was a big one. Barely breathing, she said that, and looked at the arrow wound. There, the projectile the sniper had used had been caught up in the silver thread and was wriggling, squirming. By that means, they succeeded in identifying the true nature of the poison that had struck Roswal and Marcos. Its true nature was Serena. Do you hear me, Roswal? Struggling in her fallen posture, she fumbled in her breast and brought to her lips the feel that had caught on her finger, the broken shard of the conversation mirror that Roswal had brought. When a conversation mirror is broken, its mirror face becomes a new pair and changes its connection. The link with Russell in the royal capital was severed. The mirror now paired the Serena detachment with Roswal's main force. And to that fragment of mirror, Serena proclaimed, Serena, the poison's true nature is insects. They're nesting inside your bodies. 15 Serena, the poison's true nature is insects. They're nesting inside your bodies. This information was worth its weight in gold, and it arrived just after Roswal had had every spell of the 6 attributes reflected by Jimrak, bringing about a vivid, catastrophic ruin of the forest's ecosystem. The poison's true nature, delivered through the mirror. The voice telling it, Serena's, was one holding back pain. It was a moment that made one worry something had happened to her. But Roswal, you wouldn't want that kind of concern voiced, would you? Though they had only known each other a short time, he respected the ferocity of her way of being. Roswal swallowed the unneeded words of solicitude and poured his all into seizing the victory she would desire. Marcos, for his part, also seemed to be struggling against the enemy's whole card as Roswal was. He had not fallen, but his white knight's uniform was dyed with blood here and there, a wretched sight. With the poison's progress helping matters along, the mere fact that he could fight at all with that level of bleeding made him monstrous enough. In that case, they might as well make him a monster in both name and deed. Roswal. Marcos. At Roswal's sharp call, Marcos responded without looking back. Marcos swung his leg up high, very high, and brought it down. In an instant, there came a quake so great it could make one think the whole kingdom had shaken, and fissures tens of meters long opened in the forest floor. The tremendous impact hurled even Uluzo, in his silver sphere form, far away. And where he was thrown, there was Jimrak. For a moment, it seemed Uluzo's silver sphere would smash Jimrak's formidable defenses. Uluz. No way, no way, are you aiming for friendly fire? If so, that's far too sweet, far too sweet. Jimrak. Won't happen, not like that. We close. That hope of friendly fire was shattered by the steel giant who caught the silver sphere with ease. In fact, they had not failed to consider a plan to pierce a sturdy shield with a powerful spear. But seeing the result, they knew they had done well to discard it. It was far too slender a thread to rely on. Therefore, their real trump was something even more unrealistic, and yet eminently practical. Roswal. It'll feel so bad you could die, but please us don't die. Marcos. That depends on how hard you twist the knob. Get on with it. While Jimrak and Uluzo rejoined, Roswal and Marcos regrouped as well. Then Roswal moved behind Marcos and pressed his hand to that burly back. Beneath that armor of thick muscle, the insects the sniper had shot in were doing their mischief. Most likely, they were the kind that parasitized their target's gait and devoured its mana. For both magicians and flow method users, it was a loathsome tactic of the insect cage tribe, a natural enemy. But if it was insects and not poison, if it called for insecticide and not antidote, there was a countermeasure. Roswal. Elgoa! He chanted, altered mana, interfered with the world, and manifested the desired phenomenon to accomplish his aim, and the resulting hellfire mercilessly swallowed Marcos's entire body. Uluz, what Wyatt? Jimrak, burned ally, frightening flames. It was a sudden development, and the two enemies were the ones who wavered. Roswal had abruptly started to burn his own ally. It was only natural to be shocked, no surprise if they doubted his sanity. However, this was neither madness nor suicidal folly. Roswal. On the contrary, it's the best move to wee in. The very instant Roswal declared as much, a tremendous gale rose, and a blow fired with shell-like speed and force rammed into Jimrak's torso. Jimrak, ugh! The strike was so powerful that the shock driven in one side burst out Jimrak's back. On both the impact point and the point where it burst out, a spiderweb of cracks spread across that dull-colored hard skin, and the steelman's gigantic body toppled forward, helpless. Even so, Jimrak, with that sudden blow upon him, had shielded his partner, flinging him sideways. And then Jimrak. Lose. A huge hand seized Jimrak's head as he spoke to his partner, and the boulder smashed it. Again and again and again, the steelman's head was mushed and buckled. Again and again and again until it lost all original shape. The boulder punched that face, punched and punched and punched and punched and punched and punched. Uluz. Stop, Stuop. Uluzo swung his silver tail and struck the arm holding Jimrak's head. It gouged out a great portion of the boulder's arm, but did not go so far as to sever it. On the contrary, the gouged portion immediately reconstituted as if filled in, plunging Uluzo into despair at his inability to save his partner. And so the one-sided violence between the steelman and the boulder reached its end. Oh! With a ponderous sound, Jimrak, his head crushed in, lay down upon the earth. The steelman no longer twitched, and the one who had accomplished it with overwhelming force, the boulder, no, Marcos, looked down at his own hands. Marcos, oi, what the hell is happening to me? Roswal, burning the bugs was the main. No, at this point, burning the bugs might actually be the side benefit. Marcos, that's no answer, and you didn't warn me beforehand either. Roswal, I did not warn Yao. Even so, I'd like you to feel honored. It's a stone armor that self-repairs and self-propagates, fueled by your mana. Ordinarily, it's too heavy to achieve usable weight and strength, but a monster like you can handle it. Marcos, who are you calling monster? Who are you? He might have grumbled so, but the sight of that gigantic frame clad in the helm and armor of the boulder was, to understate it, the very incarnation of a mass of rock, an inhuman figure to give any brat nightmares at a glance. Roswal's master, who had branded this a forbidden art incomplete, would surely clap their hands in praise. Contrary to its original use, the forbidden art, once thought to have no use beyond binding an opponent's movements with rock that self-propagated by devouring mana, or crushing them under its own weight, had been used properly at last. Truly, to bring forth bolder Marcos Gildark, the forbidden art was complete. Uluzo, Oh, poor Jimrack. Before Jimrack's corpse, head smashed and beaten to death, Uluzo wept tears. Given how coordinated their teamwork had been, Uluzo and Jimrack, and the insect cage sniper, must have had their history, their bonds. Roswal, but we shall have no chance to speak of it over shared drink. Uluz. Indeed. Watching the demonic aura leak from all over Uluzo's body as he stood, wiping away a torrent of tears, Roswal activated the mana within himself, interfered with the insects inside his body, and gave them surplus mana they could not assimilate, forcing self-destruction. Feeling the insects die and his gate freed from its constriction, Roswal was certain he was on the mend. With this, Roswal, too, could face the enemy in full condition. However, Silver Tail, Uluzo Tarask. Thus naming himself, crouched low and poised, Uluzo's fighting will was directed toward Marcos, the one who had killed his partner, and any interference from Roswal would have been boorish in the extreme. Marcos Gildark, royal guard of the kingdom of Lugunica. Receiving Uluzo's intent, Marcos, too, set himself to take it head-on. The pause was an instant, the opening of hostilities came right after, and the result in a heartbeat. Straight on, the raging silver sphere charged at Marcos, now become the boulder. Marcos, without a hint of play, met it from the front with a fist he unleashed. It was a primal armament any human could possess, even if not a weaponkin armored from birth. A pure, unrestrained, unhesitating smash of the fist. Fist and silver sphere collided head-on. The shock that was born, the balance, lasted but a moment, shattered into the shape of the fist that had driven through it. The silver sphere burst, and Uluzo's silver tail was torn off at the root. Uluz. Ha, too splendid. Stripped of his innate armament and slammed into the ground, the weaponkin praised the victor. Flat on his back, Uluzo smiled with a twisted cheek, and Marcos, his true face hidden beneath the rock mask of the boulder, tightened his fist once more and raised it. The loser lauded the victor. From the victor to the loser came not a single word. Uluz, an ideal, too ideal, a death. Staring at the falling fist, Uluzo was satisfied to his very end. Quite literally overpowering the two assassins with monstrous arms, Marcos slowly turned back. Meeting him from the front, Roswal nodded deeply. Roswal, but there's no excuse to be made. You are an impeccable monster, through and through. Marcos. Shut it. Get this off me now. I'm boiling in here. Still stroking the ever-thickening stone armor with a stony arm, Marcos said as much. To that, Roswal dipped his chin with a indeed, and looked up at the sky. That he had done it for the sake of victory was an immovable fact, but a forbidden art was a forbidden art. How was he to explain it to Marcos, who now wore what had been sealed for a reason? The tragic fact that the authority to take off that boulder did not belong to Roswal, the caster. 16, after conveying the poison's true nature to Roswal through the mirror, Serena, too, was facing her trial by fire. She strangled the creepy insect tangled in the silver thread, then moved the thread as is to compress the wound. Impressed at what a handy thing it was, she slowly raised the body she had been lying down. And then, Serena, let's strike a fresh deal. Reveal who conceived this plan, I won't do you wrong. Fixing her gaze on Alagar's twin eyes looking down at her, Serena pressed the question head-on. At Serena's question, Alagar was struck dumb, but he hastily smothered the agitation racing through his whole body and at once put on a sardonic face. Alagar, you're gonna jump me like that out of nowhere. What are you even, Serena? Don't dodge, it's a waste of time. In this affair, the assassins were far too well prepared. In this case, there are two possibilities. Either it didn't matter which special envoy was targeted, so preparations were brief, or the target envoy had been decided in advance, allowing them to carry out an attack without any loose ends. Alagar. Serena. If it's the former, then I'm a fool making a wild guess. But if it's the latter, you being caught in the kingdom was also part of the plan. In other words, you're one of the assassin's people. As she spoke, Serena produced the basis for her deduction, the key to Alagar's manacles that she had found while searching the charred breast of the Imperial soldier's corpse used as bait, and smiled. Naturally, if Alagar was one of the assassins, they would need an inside man to remove those manacles. That insider getting caught up in the first attack and ending up a charred corpse was probably an unfortunate accident. And just as Serena finished laying out the deduction she had assembled, a lagger, "You got any idea what the hell you're saying?" In a low, growling murmur, a lagger's scrawny body transformed with an audible creak. His brawny frame swelled, covered over by dark brown fur, and even the bones of his head reshaped. A beat later, what stood there was a werewolf in bestial form with manacles still on, fearsome even so. A lagger. If that were true, there's no way you'd be gettin' out of this forest alive. Breathing a rank breath out of his open maw, a lagger bared his fangs at the badly wounded Serena. For the moment, it was just the two of them here, him and Serena. Even if he was unreliable, Heinkel had been a deterrent. With him gone, Serena had no means to subdue a bestial lagger by force. Therefore, there was only one way for Serena Drackroy to get out of this place. "Serena, throw in with me, a lagger. Galahad Drackroy. My foolish father has no caliber." A lagger. "WH. Serena, no doubt the condition he offered was a guarantee of your freedom after my assassination. But do you think a man who, fearing for his own position, plotted his daughter's murder has the mettle to defy His Majesty the Emperor's edict and let a werewolf live?" Seeing a lagger's eyes widen, Serena felt both relief and disappointment. Relief, in that it confirmed her deduction. Disappointment, not that her kin was after her life, but in the sloppiness of the plan. The mastermind was Serena's greatest political enemy, her own father, Galahad Drackroy. That explained everything that had happened thus far. Galahad had refrained from executing a lagger, the captured werewolf, and let him flee to the kingdom. He had had his daughter appointed special envoy, and selected her as a pitiful sacrifice to open hostilities with the kingdom. No doubt, for that father of hers, this counted as using his head, but his lack of discernment of people was fatal. "Serena, if I can secure certainty, I can drag down a father who toyed with such a worthless scheme. One way or another, that man has no future. Side with me. Unlike my father, I can judge people." A lagger. "How am I supposed to tell that ain't just you beggin' for your life?" "Serena, don't be absurd. You should have seen it yourself. How many junctures were there up to now where, had it not been me, you would have died? By that same number, you have hard proof I surpass my father." Declaring so, Serena seized the opening as a lagger went pale and stretched out her hand. Just like that, she slid the key taken from the corpse into the keyhole of a lagger's manacles and turned it. With a light metallic clink, the heavy manacles came off and fell to the ground. "Ah!" A lagger's throat quivered in shock, and Serena smiled at him as he stared down at the hands that had been set free. It was a ferocious smile befitting a noble of the Valatian Empire, a sword wolf's smile. "Serena, throw in with me, a lagger. That is your path to survival, and the choice you must make to truly win your freedom." 17 Heinkel. "Gah!" Shot through by a jolt he'd lost count of, Heinkel's throat let out a strangled groan. Told by the wounded Serena to rush out and finish the hidden sniper, Heinkel had charged forward. But the speed of his headlong dash dulled, and his head filled up with its usual whining. A desire to abandon Serena and the others and bolt at full speed welled up. But Heinkel, "No, no, this is poison. It's bad." Having taken the same projectiles as Marcos and Roswal, Heinkel was already being eaten away by the same poison as they were. So was Serena. Getting an antidote was an absolute must. If they failed at that, they wouldn't make it home alive. He wouldn't be able to slink back home with his tail between his legs. Heinkel, "You." The surge of emotion from Serena telling him to return to his family revived, and his running speed came back. Shaking off his inner conflict, he ran in a cloud of dust, and straight at Heinkel from the front came the next projectile. He could see its trajectory, and yet he couldn't dodge. It would hit. It would hurt. Even so, he ran and ran and ran. And then he found a compound-eyed demi-human, left half his body charred, lying prone and close to death. Heinkel locked eyes with innumerable eyes on someone who looked like they might die even if left alone, and his whole body went rigid. With wounds like those, a single sword stroke from Heinkel would surely finish him. Strike any part of him, strike even the ground at his side, and he looked ready to die from it. His regained speed dulled again. And that pallid face of Heinkel's was reflected in every one of the sniper's compound eyes, and letting out a pathetic whimper of "Hi." Heinkel found the prone sniper pointing his right arm, hollowed like a tube, the muzzle that spat the bolts for sniping, at Heinkel's head. Thus the next shot from the muzzle would pierce Heinkel's head at the very last moment. Stranger, JIEI. In a do-or-die burst, a silver flash of focused spirit sped forth and mercilessly lopped off the sniper's head. That sword light was too dazzling. Beyond the spouting blood of the demi-human, Heinkel saw a familiar face standing, and his throat quivered. Heinkel, father! Before the dumbstruck Heinkel's eyes stood a man with the hem of the Royal Guard's white uniform fluttering, the captain of Lugunica's knights, the swordmaster known by the epithet Sword Demon, and none other than Heinkel's own father, Wilhelm van Astrea. At the entry of Wilhelm, who should not have been there, Heinkel's eyes flew wide open in stunned fixation. But Wilhelm himself flicked the blood from his sword, and without so much as turning around. Wilhelm, I heard the situation from someone of Housefellow, the Imperial Special Envoy. Heinkel, over on that mountain road. Only she was shot by that one just now. Wilhelm, we go render aid. If anything happens to the envoy, it will be a problem. With that, Wilhelm jerked his chin and moved to run past Heinkel. He halted for just an instant, glanced briefly at Heinkel, Wilhelm. You are no, never mind. We hurry. He started to say something, then dropped it and took off running. W8! Cried Heinkel as he hastily picked up the sniper's gear and gave chase to that back. The sniper was down. All that remained was Serena's safety and finding an antidote among the belongings. But that frail relief of Heinkel's was erased by a shocking sight. Serena, you're late, Knight Heinkel, returning in triumph to your family. So Serena greeted Heinkel and Wilhelm. Leaning against the slope, she had no sign of the werewolf who was to be transported with her. There were only the savage claw marks, literal claw marks, carved across Serena's beautiful face, slashing down her left cheek. Heinkel, Special Envoy, that wound, that werewolf. Blood flowed profusely down Serena's cheek. The wound could hardly be called shallow, and because she was a woman of great beauty, it looked all the more painful. Even so, while Heinkel flustered, Serena herself only shrugged, her face betraying nothing of the pain. Serena, he bared his fangs at me, taking advantage of your absence. As you can see, I took a hit. Wilhelm, we must treat you at once. What became of the werewolf in question? Kneeling beside Serena while Heinkel stood rooted, Wilhelm asked after the vanished werewolf's whereabouts. Serena jerked her chin toward the rock face of the slope. There was a pool of blood there different from Serena's wound, and what looked like a trail from something dragging itself continued over the rock face and out of sight. Serena, even if I was taken by surprise, I won't fall behind a shackled criminal. I hit back and watched him drop off the cliff. I can't see from here. Can you confirm the body? Wilhelm, no. Unfortunately, there seems to be a river flowing below the cliff. That said, with this much blood loss, if he sank to the riverbed, he won't be coming back up. At that answer, and as Wilhelm began tending her cheek wound, Serena gave a short "I see," then flicked her eyes at the still-standing Heinkel and made a sign. It took a moment of stupefaction before he understood what that sign meant. This was the painful, blood-reeking play Serena and a lagger had staged. If he cooperated with them, she would let him go. Serena had made that offer to a lagger. Guarding a werewolf, thought Heinkel, but it seemed she meant to keep that promise. To do so, she had taken on a wound that would not disappear, and she was forcing Heinkel to deceive those around them, to deceive Wilhelm van Astrea, and claim the werewolf had died. It was an ask that gnawed far too deeply at Heinkel's heart. But, Serena, don't look so pale, Knight Heinkel. This wound is my medal. It is not your fault. Heinkel added as if to press the point, and Heinkel drew in a breath and fell silent. Wilhelm's back was turned as he tended Serena. Heinkel could not see his face, but he was afraid to ask what Wilhelm, the sword demon, had thought of the words just exchanged. A surge to cast aside all falsehood and spill everything rose up, but doing that would only worsen relations between the kingdom and the empire. Heinkel, as always, was at a dead end. Heinkel, Luana, Reinhard. Murmuring his wife's and son's names, Heinkel set his hand on the hilt of the sword that had not swung and hung his head. At least he could go home. Clinging to that alone, Heinkel held his tongue. 18. Russell, by a hair, but I'm relieved the night captain made it to the scene in time. Roswell, my, we were saved by you getting everything arranged. Without that, by now a lagger would have escaped, Sir Rena and Sir Heinkel would have been killed, and we'd be headed for a war between the kingdom and the empire. Russell, we're still left with 2 fissures in parent-child relations and a number of issues involving the werewolf. So saying, Russell shrugged at Roswell, who had returned safely from a critical situation. To be frank, it had been a teeth-grinding stretch for Russell, who had remained in the royal capital. In the end, being able to send the decisive reinforcements to the site could be called his one saving achievement. That achievement seemed to have created yet more needless friction in the Sword Saint line, but that house's dysfunction hadn't started yesterday. In any case, as for a Sword Saint who had abandoned functioning as a sword of the kingdom, Russell could not be bothered. Roswell, at any rate, everyone came back safe. That's what matters most, right? Russell, yes, no question, though saying everyone's safe is a bit misleading, isn't it? Roswell, who had tried to wrap things up neatly, raised one eyebrow at Russell's words. Even if he put on a face like he didn't know what Russell was talking about, there was no way to gloss it over. After all, the clearest proof of that misleading bit was right there in the most conspicuous place of the Royal Research Institute of Magic's lab, where the 2 of them were speaking, surrounded by researchers. Marcos, oi, Roswell, make the gawkers back off. Don't let him stare like I'm a sideshow. In the middle of the lab, thus grumbling resentfully, was a lump of rock, apparently Marco's. The voice and the ill temper in the gestures were Marco's to the core, but Russell could not confirm the face. It seemed to be the effect of Roswell's trump card forbidden art. He had, at last, become something not quite human. Russell, if nothing else, it's become clearer than before that approaching you carelessly is dangerous, hasn't it? Marcos, you're laughing in your voice, idiot. Roswell, change me back. I'll beat you senseless. Roswell, that forbidden art is tied to your odd. Unless you learn to control your mana and switch it by your own will, you'll have no choice but to live on as a steelman, I'm afraid. Marcos, don't talk like it's someone else's problem. The hell kind of stunt is this? Roswell, a token of friendship, a gift. Once you master it, even bolts 10 times as strong as this time won't be able to pierce you. No more being poisoned either, the birth of a bona fide monster. Marcos, I'll kill you. With a weighty rumble, Marcos swung his arm while still in Rockman state. What that boulder smashed wasn't Roswell, but the ice and earthen targets Roswell had conjured up. Shut into the lab, Marcos was, apparently, being made to learn how to handle the forbidden art through live-fire drills like this. Russell was no expert, but he did wonder whether simply raging around in anger like that would truly be effective. Russell, let's hope this is not just you teasing Sir Marcos as usual. Roswell, goodness, no such thing. Even I don't think Marcos could welcome his lady home in that body. If the House of Gildark died out in his generation, it would be more than heartbreaking. Russell, the house is it. Picking up Roswell's remark, Russell lowered his gaze to his hands. There lay the cracked conversation mirror. For this whole affair, Russell's own price had been no more than that, but Roswell's price had been by no means light. Russell, is it worth so much, forging a friendship with Special Envoy Drakroy? Or is there a fear that, upon her return, she will immediately bend to the malice of her father, her political foe? Roswell, testing someone with something you don't even believe yourself, that's a bad habit of yours as it is of mine. She'll see it through properly. That's why you helped me cross that dangerous bridge, isn't it? With one eye closed, turning the blue eye his way, Roswell drew a sigh from Russell. Roswell had called it crossing a dangerous bridge, but even that was a bit misleading. Russell had not crossed the bridge. He had only taught how to cross and shut his eyes while it was crossed. Those who truly crossed the bridge were Roswell, and then Roswell. Now then, what should I call you who will become no one from here on? Turning, Roswell addressed one man at the back of the room, his face swathed in thick bandages, and to that needling question, the man's sharp gaze flashed. Only that gaze retained a trace of his old impression. Once those thick bandages were unwound, a face utterly remade, wholly different from before, would be revealed. It was said the technique involved considerable agony, with unceasing pain continuing endlessly until completion. Still, one needed at least that much resolve, for this was to be born anew. In the first place, where the mother bears the pain to give birth, in being born again the person himself ought to taste the pain. The being who had been a werewolf kept silent for a while, and then stranger. "Gwaine, my dead father's name." "Roswal. I see. A fine name, isn't it, Gwaine?" Without asking the reason or the story behind the choice, Roswal nodded to the werewolf, to Gwaine, who had been a lagger. Then, holding up a single finger, he continued, "Roswal, it goes without saying, but don't forget the promises you made with me and Serena. From here on, Gwaine, I know I'll never bestialize again, no, won't. If I can live without doing it, I swear. Roswal, so we begin with your choice of words, A fine mindset, wouldn't you say ye?" Answering solemnly, Gwaine drew a satisfied smile from Roswal. Even to Russell's eye, his attitude was far more compliant than what he'd heard over the mirror. The resolve not to let go of a chance to live anew, that seemed genuine. More to the point, it had to be, or Russell would be the one in trouble. Roswal, from here on, you'll live with your demi-human nature kept secret. So Russell teach Gwaine how to live well. You're my accomplice in deceiving both kingdom and empire, aren't you? Russell, you say what you like. I am not kind. As you say, you're a nobody who has crossed a dangerous bridge. If I'm to take you in, then I will require work commensurate with the investment. Shrugging, Russell made it plain. Housefellow would henceforth be Gwaine's keeper. Roswal and Serena had decided to let the werewolf live, but in place of those two, so irresponsibly leaving the method to someone else, Russell would give the man who had nowhere to go both work and home. Of course, it was no act of charity. If the House of Mathers of the Kingdom and the House of Drakroy of the Empire had forged friendship, and Russell could bite in having seized on both houses' weaknesses, it was not a bad cut for his share. Moreover, according to his divine protection of evaluation, Gwaine looked to be a decent find. Russell, even so, it was a miscalculation. Roswal, oh, it's rare for you to miscalculate. What did you misread? Touching his chin and murmuring, Russell drew a tilt of the head from Roswal. It was, unusually, a simple question devoid of teasing, and Russell answered with a wry smile. You, Russell. It was the same when you drew the Brotherhood and the Golden Wing faction out of Costul. Are you, surprisingly, a sentimental busybody, Roswal? Roswal. Ha ha ha, what a funny jokey. I consider you my friend, you know? That this counted as his answer to Russell's words was galling in the extreme. At that exchange, Gwaine gave a heh-heh, managing a smile even with his face bandaged, and from the lab there came the roaring crash of Marco's rampaging. For an affair that could, perhaps, have become a turning point in the histories of the kingdom and the empire, here were the principal actors who had moved in the midst of the maelstrom, gathered and making this boisterous ruckus. Russell, is this not, after all, the august Royal Research Institute of Magic? Roswal, indeed it is. Don't you know, Russell, magic is what makes dreams come true. With only that, something awfully childlike, Roswal laughed. Finding in that smile a boyishness befitting his years at last, Russell shrugged. What he sought was the maintenance of Lugunica's peace and tranquility. For Russell Fellow, who put that first above all else, this seemed, unexpectedly, a not bad place to set things down. 19. Left behind within the roaring, blazing dragon carriage, raising beast-like death throes, Galahad Drakroy met his end, and Serena Drakroy looked down upon it. Serena. He cares enough about appearances to pay a visit to a daughter who returned home with a deep wound on her face and in despair. That shallowness was your downfall, Galahad Drakroy. Gazing at the inferno from the office of the mansion he had come to visit, Serena murmured without sentiment. He had drawn up plans, gathered adepts, and schemed this and that, but what proved decisive were that the werewolf who clung to life retained a shred of nobility, and that he misread his daughter's ferocity. Neither was an irretrievable blunder on its own, but together they culminated in a searing end. Days of struggle with her father, ended by flame. She would take this wound on her cheek as a final gift. Touching, over the bandage, the painful scar carved into the left cheek of the unfilial daughter, left by a werewolf's claws, and feeling the ache that would not quite fade, Serena's lips formed a smile. Serena, this should cut down on those vexing marriage talks as well. If I wanted a man repellent, taking Roswal as my consort would have been most to my taste, but he settled into the friend's slot far too quickly. An unfathomable man. Thinking of the elusive friend she had made in the kingdom, Serena closed one eye. It was a pity she could not bring him into her grasp, but Roswal had contributed more than enough to Serena's plan. He had saved Serena from the ambush, and he had done a lagger, whom Galahau had used, a good turn, and made him keep the promise between him and Serena. Precisely because it was a promise that could not be fulfilled in the Empire, this was one thing she absolutely wanted to uphold, even if it meant borrowing Roswal's hand. After all, Serena was the one who had dragged a lagger in. For Galahau's arranged assassination plot had been a trap that Serena herself had set in motion. Serena, if we don't know when the poison will be laced in, we prepare a plate on which we can easily lace it. She did not know the plan's specifics, but if she laid out a path that made it easy to act and gave it a push, then when they would strike would become plain. A lagger had been a victim swept up into the Drakroy family's political strife. Therefore, Serena had an obligation to save a lagger. Serena, no, there is one more who became a sacrifice. Heinkel Istria, who had wounded Serena, the transport subject, and under the pretext of preventing war, had forced both the kingdom and her own father to hold their tongues. He too had been made to draw a most miserable short straw. Unreliable in many ways, and a man racked with troubles, Heinkel was someone to whom she would have to repay her debt someday. Whether such an opportunity would ever come between Serena and Heinkel, she did not know. At any rate, Serena. From here it begins. Having seized the reins of House Drakroy at long last, Serena had many ambitions in mind. Because of the failure of this special envoy affair, her standing in the imperial capital might worsen somewhat. Still, compared to being forever hamstrung by her kin, it would now be easier to take a large next step. Child, Lady Serena, outside, it's burning like crazy. Child, is this the time to say that, you idiot? Bring water. Ah, it's spreading. As Serena turned things over in her head, the voices of the children began to clamor around the dragon carriage burning before the mansion gate reached her ears. They were the future cards she had set her eyes on and was raising at the Drakroy estate. For now, however, they were nothing but troublesome problem children, far from dependable. Serena, you lot don't carelessly go near the flames. Wounds from battle are an honor. Burns from accidents are only laughed at. Throwing the window open to chide the problem children thus, Serena stood with an exasperated sigh and started out of the office to head for the gate herself. As she went, Roswal, who plotted for the future about as she did, crossed her mind. Bearing grand ideals no less than Serena's, Roswal would surely keep walking forward. If ever there came a chance to lend him strength, she, too, would meet it with all she had. For that was how Serena Drakroy, the scorching lady, would show friendship across the border between kingdom and empire to a friend who had inspired in her a respect she seldom felt for those of her own years. A friend for whom she had felt camaraderie before any stirrings of romance. And